Chapter 107. White Lotus stood rooted to the ground, her mouth half open. She looked a little sluggish, as if she hadn't come back to her senses for a while. After a while, she said in astonishment, I did it? If it wasn't you, who else could it be? Lu Chen fell to the ground, took 2 deep breaths, and then sneered, Isn't this your precious artifact? White Lotus subconsciously touched the pendant on her chest, only to feel that it was as warm as usual, and there was no change in the light. After thinking for a moment, she said with some uncertainty, Just now. I really didn't mean to kill you, although I feel that you are not a good person. Lu Chen said, You're cruel by nature. You don't even think before you kill, do you? White Lotus was startled, her face revealing a suspicious expression, but it seemed that she really had a little doubt about herself. She stammered, shouldn't be. What shouldn't be? Lu Chen interrupted White Lotus's recollection, saying, I just shouted for you to quickly stop, or else we will all die. Do you remember? White Lotus pondered for a moment. Finally, a little embarrassment flashed across her face and said, I think I heard this sentence. Pumph. Lu Chen covered his chest with his hand, sucking in a cold breath. In addition, blood flowed and dyed the lapel of his clothes red. It looked like he was half dead. Speaking of which, it was strange. Not long ago, the two of them were still fighting and killing each other, but at this moment, White Lotus was somewhat embarrassed. She sat on the bed for a moment, then stood up, took 2 steps towards Lu Chen, and then stopped, saying, Uncle, are you okay? I saw your sinister and ruthless appearance just now. You shouldn't die so easily, right? Lu Chen rolled his eyes and heaved a sigh of relief in his heart. But then he spat and said, Do you want me to stab you in the heart twice? White Lotus frowned. Just as she was about to say something else, there was a sudden knock on the door from the other side of the door. Puff, 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 puff. Brother Lu, are you home? I went to the spiritual field, but I didn't see you and Atsu. A clear and melodious voice came from outside. It was Xianxia's voice. Everyone in the room was stunned at the same time. Then, Lu Chen and White Lotus looked around at the same time and saw that the room was in a mess. All the tables and chairs, including the bed and bedding, had been smashed into pieces and scattered around the room. It looked like a sudden storm had swept through the place. White Lotus immediately shook her head at Lu Chen, and Lu Chen also nodded without hesitation. However, Atsu reacted faster than them. The black dog leaped up, overjoyed, and barked wildly in the direction of the door. Woof, 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 woof. Lu Chen, White Lotus, the 2 people in the room looked at each other, and the voice outside the door suddenly became louder, full of joy and laughter. Ah, Atsu, you're home. Brother Lu is here too, right? Quick, open the door for me. After a pause, Xianxia smiled and said, Atsu, I've brought you some delicious bones. The black dog became even more excited. Its tail wagged wildly, and it rushed to the door. It jumped up and down, using its forelimbs to fiddle with the door latch. It looked like it was trying hard to open the door for Xianxia. White Lotus turned her gaze back to Lu Chen, and Lu Chen looked back at her. After a while, White Lotus suddenly said, Why is your dog so stupid? Lu Chen coughed and said, It was an accident. With a bang, the door latch was pried open by Atsu. Xianxia pushed the door open with a smile and walked in. Atsu enthusiastically pounced on her, lying on her body and rubbing against her. Xianxia affectionately patted Atsu's head and smiled. Then she took out a bag and poured out a few bones. She smiled and said, Atsu, eat. Atsu cheered and ran to the side with the bones in its mouth. Xianxia stood up and looked forward. At the same time, she smiled and said, Brother Lu, why are you so early today? Her voice suddenly stopped, and her smile seemed to freeze on her face. She saw the terrible state of the room and was momentarily speechless. After a while, she saw Lu Chen sitting on the ground with his hand covering his chest and half of his body bleeding. She suddenly screamed and ran over. She lost her voice and said, Brother Lu, what happened to you? Lu Chen smiled bitterly and said, I suffered a little injury. Xianxia's face suddenly turned pale. Then she looked around and saw White Lotus standing on the other side of the room. She looked at the broken pieces of the room and seemed to understand something. She stared at White Lotus and shouted, "You hurt Brother Lu?" White Lotus hesitated and said, "Maybe yes." Xianxia only felt a sudden surge of anger. She suddenly stood up and shouted at White Lotus, "Brother Lu is such a good person. He stands aloof from worldly affairs. It is impossible for him to provoke you, the eldest daughter of the Bai family. Why did you hurt him?" "Huh." Lu Chen and White Lotus were shocked at the same time. Lu Chen pulled Xianxia and said, "How do you know her identity?" Xianxia said angrily, "That day, I saw her at the mountain gate with you. I was a bit curious, so I went to ask around. Kunwa City is only so big and there are only so many aristocratic families, so I naturally found out." As she spoke, she took a step forward and stood in front of Lu Chen. Although White Lotus looked younger and wasn't as tall as Xianxia, her imposing manner seemed to overwhelm Xianxia, causing Xianxia to be cautious. However, she still looked angry and said, "Miss Bai, you already have such a talented background. Moreover, you are favored by the heavens and are about to become a true sovereign's disciple. There is a world of difference between the two of you. Why did you come to bully an ordinary odd-job disciple like Brother Lu?" She didn't know why, but when she saw Xianxia's angry but beautiful face, White Lotus felt speechless. In the end, she could only shake her head. Even her voice became a bit lower and she said, "You misunderstood." "What did I misunderstand?" Xianxia looked angry and didn't believe what she said. "Forget it, Xianxia." At this time, Lu Chen pulled on Xianxia's sleeve from behind. After she turned around, he said, "Just now, I was careless, I fell and hurt myself. Don't blame Miss Bai." "You fell yourself, and you even injured your chest so badly?" Xianxia looked like she had seen a ghost. Lu Chen laughed dryly, then looked at White Lotus and said, "Miss Bai, we can be considered no discord, no concord. Why don't we just let it go?" White Lotus stared at him, and after a moment, she slowly nodded and said, "You're right. There's nothing between us. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. But what happened before?" The corner of Lu Chen's mouth revealed a trace of a smile. He cut her off and said, "Let's mind our own business in the future. What do you think?" But White Lotus pondered for a moment, then nodded and agreed. Then she walked towards the door. Xianxia looked at White Lotus unhappily. It seemed that she was still holding a grudge. But when she walked to the door, White Lotus suddenly turned around and looked at Xianxia. "May I ask which family are you from?" As she spoke, Bai Lian's expression had completely returned to normal. She had returned to the elegant, cold, and otherworldly beauty of a young girl like a banished immortal. The speed and smoothness of the change made Lu Chen secretly speechless. Xianxia hesitated for a moment, but then she thought that with the ability and background of the person in front of her, it wouldn't be difficult for him to find out her background. So she directly replied, "My surname is Yi." White Lotus was clearly startled. After thinking carefully for a moment, she seemed to recall something. She said, "Oh, the Yi family in the east of the city, right?" Xianxia said, "Yes, what do you want?" White Lotus smiled. "You're thinking too much. We are all descendants of aristocratic families and disciples of the same sect. There will be many opportunities for us to take care of each other in the future. There's no need for us to be enemies." She was extremely beautiful to begin with, so when she spoke in such a natural and unrestrained manner, it was hard for anyone to dislike her. Xianxia also couldn't keep a straight face. She pursed her lips and waited for a moment before replying, "Oh." However, White Lotus's gaze then shifted to Lu Chen, who was behind Xianxia. Suddenly, she said seriously, "Sister Yi, I have something to say to you." Xianxia was taken aback. She wasn't used to White Lotus suddenly calling her sister. After all, although she was innocent, she still understood some basic principles. White Lotus's identity, status, and background were too different from hers. Even if White Lotus was young, Xianxia really didn't expect her to call her sister. She was stunned for a moment before saying, "What?" White Lotus said, "I think Sister Yi should be a good person with a kind heart. But this uncle, hey, can't you stop calling him uncle?" White Lotus ignored the other person's complaints and said to Xianxia with a gentle expression, "I think you should be careful of this man. He looks harmless and gentle, but in fact he is vicious and cruel. I have never seen such a person in my life. If you get too close to him, you will hurt yourself sooner or later. She looked sincerely at Xianxia, her eyes clear and pure, like the most beautiful and flawless flower in the world. She said gently, "The two of you are not the same kind of people. Don't be with him." The room suddenly became silent. No one spoke for a while. The atmosphere seemed to be slightly awkward, but after a moment, Xianxia suddenly frowned. The scar on her cheek was still there. It was a faint scar, but it didn't seem to damage her beauty. Instead, it only added a bit of heroic spirit to her. She looked at White Lotus, looked at the girl who was destined to become an influential figure in the world in the future, the girl who was destined to become the proud daughter of the Kunlun party. Finally, Xianxia snorted and said loudly, "I don't believe it." Chapter 108. This, I don't believe, Xianxia said it resolutely, and there seemed to be no room for doubt. Even Lucian looked at Xianxia with some surprise, and his face showed some surprise. And White Lotus was obviously even more surprised, and even looked at Xianxia with some disbelief, and said, "You believe him so much?" Xianxia nodded without hesitation and said, "Yes." White Lotus was speechless. She seemed to be smart, but at this moment when facing Xianxia, she also had a feeling of helplessness. She could only shake her head and sighed and said, "Well, anyway, I have told you, don't regret it in the future." Xianxia turned her head and no longer looked at her. Obviously, she did not take this warning to heart at all. White Lotus turned her head to look at Lucian, and saw that Lucian was still sitting on the ground, and then he raised his hands slightly and smiled at her. White Lotus snorted, and did not say anything more. She turned and walked straight out of the room, and closed the door. Perhaps only the loud sound of the door closing revealed that she was a little annoyed in her heart. When White Lotus left, Xianxia hurriedly went to Lucian's side and helped him to stand up. Originally, she wanted to find a place to sit and rest, but when she saw the mess around, and there was not even a decent chair to sit on, she was stunned for a moment, and then asked Lucian, "What happened in your room? Why is everything broken?" Lucian smiled bitterly and said, "It's a long story, I will tell you in detail later." Xianxia responded. At the moment, she had no choice but to let Lucian stand first, and then went to the side to sweep a slightly cleaner place, and then put some unbroken pillows and quilts on it, and let Lucian sit down. Then she looked at Lucian with a look of concern on her face and whispered, "Brother Lu, are you really okay?" "Well, it's nothing serious. I just need to rest. My chest is just a skin wound, it's not a big deal." Xianxia breathed a sigh of relief, and a relaxed smile appeared on her face. Then she turned around and shouted, "Atsu, Brother Lu is fine, don't worry." In the corner next to the door, Atsu was happily gnawing on a bone. After hearing Xianxia's words, it raised its head and glanced at them. It wagged its tail, blinked its eyes, and then continued to gnaw on the bone without saying a word. The smile on Xianxia's face suddenly froze. After a while, she laughed dryly and turned to Lucian and said, "Brother Lu, look, Atsu must be starving." Lucian spat and said, "Stupid dog, if there is a chance in the future, I will kill you and stew you." Xianxia was shocked, and quickly grabbed Lucian's hand and begged, Brother Lu, don't eat Atsu, it's very good." Lucian was pushed a few times by her and almost fell to the ground. He could only smile bitterly and said, I know, I was just joking with you." Only then did Xianxia cheer up. She smiled like a blossoming flower. Then she found a white cloth to bandage Lucian's wound. At the same time she asked, "Big Brother Lu, why did you fight with that Miss Bai? She is different from me. She is the proud daughter of a real big family. Her family background is not bad, and I heard that Hakushin Jinkuin is going to make an exception and accept her as his third disciple. Why did you provoke such a person?" Lucian said impatiently, "First of all, I didn't know her identity at all. Second, I didn't provoke her, she was the one who looked for trouble with me." "I see." Xianxia thought for a moment and said, "Then it is Miss Bai's fault." Lucian looked at Xianxia and suddenly said, "Why do you trust me so much, including in front of Miss White Lotus? You didn't hesitate to say that you don't trust her. You scared me." Xianxia smiled and said, Because I trust you. You saved my life and helped me a lot. If I don't trust you, who else should I trust? Besides, in that scene just now, Miss Bai was standing there, but you were lying on the ground with blood all over your body and bleeding from your chest. It would be strange if she didn't bully you. Could it be that you stabbed yourself in the chest? Lu Chen was silent for a moment, then nodded and said, "Yes, what you said is very reasonable." Although Xian was also a woman from an aristocratic family, she didn't seem to be particularly spoiled at the moment. She even helped Lu Chen to start cleaning the messy house, and then swept the rubbish into piles here and there, like a small hill of different sizes. Lu Chen coughed twice and called Xian back, saying, "You've worked hard. You should take a rest first, the dust is too much, it's choking." Xian said, "Oh." She sat down with a red face, then looked at the empty house, frowned and said to Lu Chen, "Brother Lu, there is nothing in this house now, no one can live in it." Lu Chen said, "It's okay, I will find a way to add some things later. It shouldn't be a big problem." Xian said, "Then what about you and Atsu these 2 days?" Lu Chen said, "I'll sleep on the floor." Xian shook her head, her hands didn't stop bandaging his wounds, and said softly, "So pitiful." Lu Chen laughed and patted Xian's head, saying, "Have you forgotten the days we spent in the disorienting lands? We ate and slept in the wild every day, wasn't it 10 times worse than now? Now at least we have a house to hide in." Xian glanced at him and said, "It's not the same." She thought for a while, then said to herself, "I'll still help you ask for a favor, see if I can really let you squeeze into the Spirit Cultivation odd job disciple list. I heard that those who are qualified to be on the list will leave Stone Pan Valley and go to another Baichao Tang territory. The conditions there are much better than here, and you can get in touch with many elite disciples of the sect." Lu Chen suddenly felt a little moved, nodded and said, "If that's the case, then it's naturally the best, but..." He looked at Xian, a little surprised, and said, "You can even speak for such a big thing? I can't tell." Xian giggled and said, "That's not true. I'm just a new disciple who just joined the sect this year, how can I be qualified? But because I've been pretty miserable, you know, so the elders and martial uncles of Baichao Tang feel very sorry for me. If I try to please them, maybe I can help you." Lu Chen laughed and said, "Amazing, you've grown up." Xian's cheeks turned slightly red, and then she said, "Actually, it's them who pity me, not them." Halfway through her words, Xian suddenly froze, as if she suddenly thought of something. Her eyes fell on Lu Chen's face, and she seemed to be thinking about something. Lu Chen quickly felt Xian's strangeness and said, "What's wrong? Why are you looking at me like that?" Xian made a sound, looking a little hesitant, and said, "I just said that I trust you very much." Lu Chen said, I heard and saw it, thank you very much." Xian said, "I also told Miss Bai that I don't believe that she said bad things about you, but in my heart, I clearly think that she hurt you." Lu Chen coughed and said, "Yes, you see, she can't refute it, so she admitted it." Xian looked at Lu Chen with a pair of bright eyes, and Lu Chen felt a little strange under her gaze, so he glared at Xian and said, "What are you looking at? Is there a flower on my face?" "No, there's no flower." Xian said, "Brother Lu, I just suddenly thought of it. At that time, I thought that it must be her fault, because no one in the world would stab themselves with a knife. Isn't it? But didn't I do that a few days ago?" Lu Chen was speechless. Looking at Xian's somewhat serious face, he smiled bitterly and said, What are you trying to say?" Xian stared at him, and said seriously, "Brother Lu, I definitely still believe you, I think you must be a good person. But now that I think about it, after seeing that scene, if it was anyone else in the world, it must be right, only you, I suddenly feel a little guilty in my heart." "Hey, what you said makes me feel very wrong." Lu Chen suddenly frowned, and said angrily, "Why do I feel guilty when I look at you?" Xian looked at him and said, "Because you just taught me the same method, no one in the world will stab themselves with a knife, but it's different for you. When you first taught me that method, you said it so easily, now that I think about it, even if you take a knife and cut yourself, you won't even blink." This time, Lu Chen raised his voice, and his tone was full of annoyance. "Is there something wrong with your brain? You sound like I'm a crazy person. Exen stuck out her tongue and laughed out. It seemed that after thinking about it carefully, even she felt that it was a little unbelievable, so she waved her hand and said, Okay, I was just saying. Lu Chen glared at her and said, Don't talk nonsense. Exen shrugged her shoulders, stood up and said, I know, I just said it casually, look at how anxious you are. The name list for spiritual power cultivation is currently being discussed. I have to quickly go back and ask for a favor for you, to see if we can squeeze a place in. You just wait for my good news. Lu Chen agreed and said, Okay. After a pause he said, But you don't have to worry too much, do what you can. If you really can't ask for it, I will think of other ways, don't force yourself. Exen smiled and said, It's okay, I understand. As she said that, she walked towards the door, and deliberately turned to Atsu, patted its head, and said a few words, then opened the door, turned around, and waved to Lu Chen and said, Brother Lu, I'm leaving. Oh. Lu Chen responded. The door was closed. After a moment, suddenly the door opened again, and Exen poked her head in, and said to Lu Chen, Brother Lu, just now you really didn't use a knife to cut yourself? Get lost. Oh. Exen's head shrank, and she stuck out her tongue, then she smiled and left. Chapter 109. Ah, it's quite comfortable. Lu Chen let out a sigh of admiration and closed his eyes. At this moment, he was in Old Ma's Black Hill Pavilion in Kunwa City. There was not a soul in the shop, but there was now a bamboo recliner. He was lying on the recliner, and his head naturally swayed forward, making creaking sounds. Sitting next to him, Old Ma was very proud and said with a smile, Of course. This chair was made by Ming Ji, the shop with the best bamboo rattan craftsmanship in the city. I spent a lot of money to buy it. Lying on this bamboo chair, I feel like I'm floating in the air or floating on the surface of water. It's really comfortable. Spent a lot of money? Of course. Lu Chen opened his eyes, looked at Old Ma, and said sternly, You always say that you're going to die of poverty, but you still have money to buy this kind of extravagant thing. It's obvious that you're lying. Old Ma sneered and said, Is a reclining chair made of bamboo an extravagant thing? Cut the crap. I'm going to die of poverty recently, so I brought some spirit stones to help me out. Old Ma spread his hands and said, I don't have any. I bought this chair with the rest of my money. Lu Chen cast a sidelong glance at Old Ma and said with disdain, Shameless. Old Ma shook his head and said, How much is a kilogram of face worth? How many spirit stones? The morals of the world are degenerating day by day. Lu Chen closed his eyes and said with emotion. Old Ma clicked his tongue and said, Are you short of money recently? Lu Chen said, Didn't I tell you? That girl, Exen, is helping me with the spiritual power cultivation. I can't just let her do it alone. I'm thinking whether I should give her some spirit stones or not. Old Ma thought for a moment and said with some doubt, You helped her a lot before, and with the Exen's temperament, will she accept your money? Lu Chen said, I don't think so. Old Ma's face darkened and he said angrily, If you don't know how to accept it, then why are you asking me for spiritual stones? Lu Chen sneered and said, I said you're stupid and you don't want to admit it. Do you understand the ways of the world? Whether she accepts it or not is her business. Whether I give it to her or not is another matter. Old Ma frowned and thought for a while. He murmured, Now that you mention it, it seems to make sense. But why do I always feel that you want to make money from me? Despicable. Lu Chen sat up and pointed at Old Ma. He said sternly, Despicable. Old Ma was speechless. I've secretly inquired about the cultivation of spiritual power. It's true. Old Ma chased Lu Chen down from the bamboo lounge chair and then threw his fat body onto the chair. Suddenly, there was a loud squeaking sound, and then the chair swayed back and forth, making him squint his eyes in comfort. At the same time, he said, Although this job is still a handyman, it can be regarded as one of the best jobs among the handyman disciples. Indeed, there are many people who would break their heads to get involved in it. Speaking up to this point, he stretched out a fat finger and shook it at Lu Chen. In my opinion, a useless person like you with no identity, no status, and no background will not be able to compete with others. I'm afraid you're going to let down the E family's little Mississippi. Lu Chen walked to the door and leaned against it. He turned back and smiled. I'll give it a try. Anyway, I won't lose anything. What if I really get selected? Old Ma sighed and said, Do you really want to go? Lu Chen did not answer his question. He only said slowly, The cultivation of spiritual power is for the most outstanding disciples in the sect to cultivate spiritual materials. It will be useful to get in touch with the outstanding young disciples of the Kunlun party. Old Ma closed his eyes and was silent for a moment. He said, Okay, I'll think of a way. Lu Chen looked at him and said, Damn Baldy. If he was in the Kunlun Mountains, these things would be so easy to handle. Why would he stay in the immortal city all day? Old Ma suddenly smiled bitterly. There's something going on there. What's wrong? Old Ma was silent for a moment. His voice suddenly became much lower. He said, Last month, just the news from Fuyunji said that 7 more shadows had died. Lu Chen's expression did not change. However, deep in his eyes, his pupils seemed to contract slightly. He slowly turned his head and looked at the small alley outside the door. He saw that on the quiet stone road, the gray brick walls were mottled everywhere, and in some of the cracks and on the top of the wall, there were still clumps of green weeds growing tenaciously, adding a bit of life to this lonely and cold alley. A breeze blew. The weeds in the secluded and dark places swayed their stems and leaves. His clothes also swayed slightly with the wind. The wind was a little cold. After a while, he said softly, Is it just the number reported by Fuyunji? Old Ma nodded. It's just that Fuyunji reported the number themselves. No one knows how many there are in private. What are Fuyunji and the others afraid of? They're afraid of gossip, they're afraid of mockery, and they're afraid of the pressure from the undercurrents in the Immortal Alliance. Lu Chen snorted. That damn Baldy is one of the 6 true monarchs of the Immortal Alliance. His status is extremely high. As long as he supports Shuang, I don't believe that anyone would dare to touch Fuyunji. Old Ma smiled helplessly. Ordinary people naturally can't do it. But if the other 5 true monarchs say it, then it's different. Lu Chen's expression suddenly changed. His originally calm expression finally changed. Who is it? The Kunlun mountain range was majestic and undulating. In the deepest part of the mountain range, there was a vast area that was covered in thick fog all year round. It was almost connected to the white clouds in the sky. Even if there was a strong wind, it could not blow away the fog. Between the clouds and the sky, there were 4 huge mountain peaks floating in the void. They were the most famous and illustrious peaks of the Kunlun party, the 4 peaks of the sky vault and clouds. These 4 peaks were thousands of feet away from each other. Separated by the clouds and fog, one could only vaguely see the shadows of the other peaks. It was as ethereal as a fairyland, as if it was the place of the celestials in the human world. The 4 peaks had been passed down since ancient times. Although they were all on the same mountain range, they each had their own strange phenomena. They coincided with the cycle of heaven and earth and the 4 seasons. Hence, they were named according to spring, summer, autumn, and winter. The spring peak was full of vitality. The summer peak was scorching hot as if it was in a fire. The autumn peak was cold and lonely with a murderous aura. The winter peak was a world of ice and snow. Everything was desolate. The 4 peaks in such a close distance actually had such a magical phenomenon. It could be said to be a miracle of creation. In the Kunlun party, the 4 peaks of the sky vault and clouds had always been an important place in the sect. Historically, only the most important people in the sect could step on them. Ordinary disciples did not even have the right to go near them. On this day, the winter peak that was suspended high in the sky was still the same as before. It was a world of ice and snow. The white snow covered the sky, and the whole peak was pure white. The strange thing was that the other peaks not far from this peak, including the peaks of the Kunlun mountain range below it, were still full of green. It could also be considered a kind of wonder. The strong wind was fierce, blowing like a knife. The cold air seemed to be able to penetrate through the flesh and directly into the bones. It made people want to shiver uncontrollably. On the winter peak, there was a figure standing on the edge of a cliff formed by solidified ice. It was an extremely beautiful little girl of about 10 years old. It was White Lotus. At this moment, her face was cold. She was wearing a cloak. When the cold wind blew, her beautiful hair fluttered along with her clothes. She really had a kind of ethereal fairy's aura. However, she did not have the slightest bit of the fierce appearance she had when she was fighting with Lu Chen. Not to mention the strange situation where her hands were stained with blood. It was as if she was another person who had nothing to do with her. Or perhaps, no one knew which was the true face of this young girl. Her face looked a little pale. It was unknown whether it was because of the unusually cold temperature and the strong wind on the winter peak, or because she was not feeling well. However, standing at the top of the winter peak and looking down, there was a feeling that the vast Kunlun was under one's feet. The world seemed a lot smaller. Even the clouds in the sky, how could they not be under one's feet? The sound of footsteps suddenly sounded, shattering the falling snow and ice on the ground. A figure appeared behind White Lotus. It was an old man. If Lu Chen was here, he would have recognized this person. It was Xianxia, who he had seen at the mountain gate of Kunlun, who had led White Lotus up the mountain. He was also the second disciple of the legendary Hakushin Jinkun. At the same time, he was also an extremely powerful member of the Kunlun party, Jin Dan Friar. Xianxia walked to the back of White Lotus. His eyes were as sharp as lightning, sweeping across the seemingly delicate girl in front of him. A strange light flashed in his eyes, and there seemed to be a trace of complicated emotions flashing across. White Lotus turned around and saw Xianxia. For some reason, there was still no smile on her face. It was as if she had always had that kind of cold temperament since she was young. She lowered her head and bowed to Xianxia, saying, "Second brother." Xianxia nodded, then said calmly, "The strong wind here is cold. Your cultivation has not been completed, so it is not advisable for you to stay here for long. Otherwise, it will easily damage your foundation. Follow me back." White Lotus lowered her eyes and said, "Yes." Xianxia led her and turned to walk. Along the way, they saw that the ice prism was strange and abrupt, crystal clear. It was as if they were in a magical and magnificent crystal-like world. The two of them walked through this magical snowy peak that floated in the sky. There was only the never-ending whistling of the cold wind in their ears. "Brother!" White Lotus suddenly opened her mouth and called out. Xianxia said, "What?" White Lotus said, "This time, when will Master wake up?" Xianxia's footsteps paused for a moment. Then he looked up and saw that at a place thousands of feet above them, at the peak of Winter Peak, endless wind and snow surged wildly, completely wrapping that lonely peak into an indescribably huge snowy fortress, as if it was far away from the human world. "I don't know," Xianxia said calmly. What is it? Is there something?" White Lotus' hand that was wrapped in the cloak moved a little, gently holding the emerald green pendant on her chest. The warm feeling was as usual. Even in this harsh world of ice and snow, she seemed to be able to feel a sense of vitality and warmth from the emerald green branch. But it still felt like something was not quite right. White Lotus was silent for a moment, then said softly, "Nothing, just asking." Xianxia looked at her, made a sound of then continued to walk forward. The wind and snow swept past behind them, rolling up thousands of snowflakes, painting the white peak with a layer of blurriness. Chapter 110. In the front hall of the Black Hill Pavilion in Kunwa City, Old Ma didn't immediately answer Lu Chen's question. His face looked a bit unsightly. After a while, Old Ma said in a low voice, "More than one." Lu Chen's surprised expression slowly calmed down, but the light in his eyes grew sharper. After a while, he suddenly laughed and said, "Damn Baldy, you've offended everyone, haven't you?" Old Ma shook his head and said, "There's nothing we can do about it. When the devil cult was at its peak, His Excellency was in the limelight. In Zhengxianmeng, he could summon the wind and summon the rain. 10 years ago, after the battle in the desolate valley, his reputation reached its peak, suppressing the other true monarchs to the point where they didn't have any face and offended many people." Lu Chen said, "Damn Baldy is so powerful. Why isn't he arrogant now?" Old Ma coughed and said, "The world has been in turmoil for a long time. Many people in Zhengxianmeng still want to live a peaceful life. Lu Chen nodded and didn't say anything. He just looked at the alley outside, his eyes drifting. Old Ma glanced at him and a trace of worry flashed across his eyes. He said, "In Zhengxianmeng, Supremes Guanghua controls the financial power of the Immortal Alliance. He has always disliked Fuyunji and has been complaining about it for many years. Other than this lord, the Heavenly Law Hall's Iron Pot Immortal has also expressed his dissatisfaction with the Floating Clouds division." His harsh words and stern countenance were directed at Hall Master Shui Ying. However, everyone in the entire Immortal City knows who the target is. Lu Chen was slightly surprised. He frowned and said, "Tiehu? Isn't His Excellency known to be impartial and impartial? Why did he also come to join in the fun?" Old Ma smiled bitterly and said, "Because Fuyunji has a lot of problems that can't be settled. Every 2 or 3 days, a shadow would either die or go missing on patrol. No one would be able to take it. It's only because true Lord Tianlan supported Shui Ying that Hall Master Shui would have been captured and sent to the Heavenly Law Hall." Lu Chen's face turned ugly again. He coldly snorted and said, "The evil faction has become so arrogant?" He paused for a moment, then shook his head and said, "That's not right. Although those lunatics are not weak, they are not strong enough to challenge Zhengxianmeng directly." Old Ma was startled. "What do you mean by that?" Lu Chen turned his face away and looked at the empty alley outside. He seemed unwilling to say more and said, "You know what I mean." Old Ma hesitated for a moment, but he suddenly stood up from the comfortable chair and walked to Lu Chen. A rare serious expression appeared on his face and he said in a low voice, "This is a serious matter. I can't make wild guesses. No one in the world has a deeper understanding of the evil faction than you. If you have any opinion, you must clearly explain it to me, then I can report it to the Supremes." Lu Chen did not speak and only glanced at Old Ma. Old Ma sighed and said softly, "This is a serious matter. Besides, you should know in your heart that he doesn't trust many people. But he will definitely listen to what you say." Lu Chen was silent and seemed to be thinking about something. After a while, under Old Ma's anxious gaze, he faintly said, "The evil faction has indeed infiltrated the Immortal Alliance. But Fuyunji is one of the Immortal Alliance branches that have fought against the evil faction the most over the years. Regardless of strength, experience, or defense, they are all extremely strong. To be able to force Fuyunji to this state and lose so many people, the evil faction can't do it." Old Ma stared at him and said, "Then who is it?" Lu Chen suddenly smiled and said, "Whoever understands the Immortal Alliance the best, the one who is the easiest to attack, the one who benefits the most from the deaths, the one who jumps the highest and shouts the loudest, that is it." Old Ma's face suddenly turned pale. He stared at Lu Chen for a long while and finally said bitterly, "But you don't have evidence?" "I don't. Just guessing." "Just guessing? Such a big matter, I'm afraid you can't convince the public with just guessing. What's more, your words also implied those too. How can this be criticized with empty words? Since when do you need evidence in your eyes?" The room suddenly fell into silence, and no one spoke anymore. After a long time, it seemed that time had frozen in this lonely alley. When the light fell on them, the 2 ordinary figures under the ordinary eaves seemed to be just inconspicuous ants in the passage of time. "This can't be done." Old Ma softly broke the silence. "Why? What kind of people are those 2? Milord is already in a difficult situation. How can he make more enemies?" Lu Chen expressionlessly said, "You want me to speak," I said. "Whether you want to pass these words to the damn Baldy has nothing to do with me." Old Ma suddenly raised his head and looked at Lu Chen. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. A trace of a complicated look flashed across his face. In front of the alley, the silence was still there. The light and shadow changed, and the grass trembled in the wind. Lu Chen suddenly walked out of the gate and came to the opposite wall of the alley. He reached out and broke a blade of grass. The cool breeze blew slowly, dancing alone in this corner that seemed to be forgotten by the bustling city. "Do you really think so?" Old Ma's voice sounded behind him. Lu Chen fiddled with the blade of grass in his hand and said calmly, "Yes." Old Ma walked in front of him and stared into his eyes, saying, "But I feel that there seems to be another meaning in your words." Lu Chen slightly narrowed his eyes and said, "Oh, what is it?" "It has the intention to kill the heart." "I don't understand." "Speak human language. Do you still bear a grudge against Milord and want to harm him?" The breeze alley was silent again, as if there was a sudden clap of thunder. The green grass was quietly broken at the fingertips and drifted away with the wind. The clouds were gone, the sky was shining, and the alley was deep and dark. Only two figures stood under the wall. The breeze seemed to become lighter and slower, but it still blew tenaciously, sweeping up the hem of their clothes, but the palms and the sleeves could not be seen clearly. There was suddenly a sense of desolation in the wind. Lu Chen turned around and plucked a green leaf, saying lightly, "You should not say this." "I know." Lu Chen's fingers gently stroked the green leaf, his eyes bright and sharp with a bit of coldness. Even his voice seemed to be a bit colder, saying, "To say it in front of me is to suspect me. To say it to the bald head is to drive a wedge between us." The corner of old Ma's eyes seemed to twitch, but he did not speak, just kept silent. Lu Chen said again, "You and I have known each other for 10 years, you should know me very well and understand my feelings. In fact..." Old Ma suddenly interrupted him and said coldly, "In fact, I can't see through you at all. I don't know what you are thinking. Have you really let go of the things that happened 10 years ago? No one in this world will really know your feelings." Old Ma said each word slowly but clearly, staring at Lu Chen's eyes. His eyes were as sharp as a knife, as if he wanted to cut open the deep darkness in Lu Chen's eyes. There was a wind blowing, and the clothes were fluttering. Lu Chen slowly turned around and looked straight into Old Ma's eyes. The two men silently but coldly stared at each other. In the depths of his sleeve, an emerald green leaf suddenly withered and turned into a withered leaf. Then, it silently slid down to the ground. "You think too much." After a long time, Lu Chen suddenly laughed, clapped his hands, and then glanced at the sky. Seeing the blue clouds leaving, he said calmly, "You asked me, and I said it. You are not satisfied, so you suspect me. I am afraid this is a bit inappropriate." Old Ma was silent and did not answer. Lu Chen patted his shoulder and said, "Come on, fatty. In our line of work, there are people who are paranoid, nervous, and afraid all day long. In the end, there are also many who go crazy. If you go on like this, you will inevitably become a madman in the future." Old Ma closed his eyes, took a deep breath, then nodded and said, "What you said is reasonable. I was too impatient today. I'll pass on your words later." Lu Chen turned around and walked into the house, saying, "Whether to pass on the words or not, it is up to you." Old Ma followed behind him. After 2 steps, he suddenly said, "You saved my life, I have no intention of harming you." Lu Chen's footsteps paused and he said, "I know." Taking another step forward, Lu Chen said, "Fatty, in these 10 years, my life was in your hands." Old Ma was silent. Lu Chen looked at the door that was close at hand, stopped and did not go in. After a moment, he turned around and looked at Old Ma, saying softly, "It is the same now." Old Ma's body slightly shook, then a deep and complicated look flashed in his eyes. After a moment, he nodded and said, "I know." Lu Chen smiled gently and said, "Well, it is late, I am going back to the mountain." Saying this, he waved to Old Ma, then turned around and walked out of the alley. Old Ma stood on the bluestone road, silently watching the figure gradually go away, not saying a word. When Lu Chen's figure finally disappeared from sight, the fat on Old Ma's face suddenly shook a few times. At that moment, his body seemed to suddenly relax from an extremely tense state, and he let out a long breath. It was as if he had been holding his breath and hiding in the water for too long. He took a few deep breaths and wiped his forehead with his hand. Then he smiled bitterly and turned around to walk back to the house. However, he had only taken 2 steps when his body suddenly froze. He had come to a complete stop. After a moment, he suddenly walked to a place in the corner of the alley and squatted down. His white and chubby hands reached out from his sleeves and groped around the brick wall. Then he picked up something from the ground. It was a dried and charred leaf, curled up into a ball. Old Ma silently looked at the dried leaf in his hand, then raised his head to look around. The tenacious weeds growing in the cracks of the wall were slightly trembling in the wind, full of vitality, sprinkling green. In the quiet alley, a trace of haze suddenly flashed in old Ma's eyes. Chapter 111. On the Kunlun party's rocktop mountain, behind the majestic grand hall, there was a quiet hall built under pines and cypresses. Jean Dan Fryer and Melaleuca japonica often meditated here when they had nothing to do. Few people came here. Under the green pines and cypresses, the quiet hall was very quiet. The shadows of the trees were reflected on the ground, swaying slightly with the wind. Occasionally, the crisp chirping of birds could be heard from the distant forest, as if there was an otherworldly celestial atmosphere. In the quiet hall, other than the white-haired but youthful Melaleuca japonica, Texan was also kneeling at the side, carefully brewing tea, the fragrance filling the air. In a flash, the tea was ready. Exen held the cup with both hands and placed it on the table in front of Melaleuca japonica, saying, "Uncle Master, please have some tea." The teacup was pure white, crystal clear like the first snow. The tea in the cup was clear and fragrant. One sniff was enough to know that it was a very precious tea in the world. Melaleuca japonica took a sip, then nodded slightly and smiled at Exen. "Little girl, your cultivation is not yet complete, but your tea brewing skills are amazing." Exen giggled. "My family grew up planting spiritual tea. After a few generations, I dare not say anything else, but I do have the ability to brew tea." Melaleuca japonica nodded. "That's true. Back then, your family's ancestor, Iyu, was known as the Kunlun tea deity. He planted, tasted, and evaluated tea, all of which were peerless. That's why the E family passed down the family business. Even today, the E family's unique tea, Little Crane, is still famous. No wonder you are so knowledgeable in the tea ceremony." Exen blinked and moved closer to Melaleuca japonica, whispering, "Uncle Master Yen, if you like Little Crane tea, I'll sneak some for you during next year's harvest, okay?" Melaleuca japonica laughed. "You're such a crafty girl. Why not this year?" Exen pursed her lips and said, "Martial uncle, you're blaming a good person wrongly. It's not like you don't know that it's not easy to grow this Little Crane tea. The annual yield is at most 1 to 2 caddies. Even so, our Kunlun sect has set an annual quota of 70 to 80% of it as a gift. There are also some elders in the sect who like to drink tea. Not to mention Jindan cultivators like you, there are even a few Yuanning Taoist masters. Our E-clan does not dare to offend any of them." She spread her hands. "That's why when the new tea is produced this year, it'll be sold out in the blink of an eye. No matter how capable I am, I can't get more. Next year, when the tea leaves are harvested, I plan to sneak home and sneak into the tea fields to get some when it's dark." As she spoke, she looked at Melaleuca japonica with innocent and pitiful eyes. Melaleuca japonica chuckled and patted Exen's head. All right, I'm just teasing you." As he spoke, he suddenly noticed from the corner of his eyes that there was still an inch-long scar on the left side of Exen's pretty face. It was slightly red and seemed to be slightly abrupt. Her face darkened. Her fingers slid down and touched Exen's cheek. Exen seemed to feel something and shrank back. Melaleuca japonica snorted coldly. Such a beautiful face was almost ruined. Come to think of it, he got off lightly. If I had known, I would have killed him that day. Exen lowered her head slightly but quickly raised it again with a smile. "Forget it, it's all in the past. Don't be angry, Martial Aunt." Melaleuca japonica's eyes were filled with pity. "You're so young, yet you suffered so much for no reason. It must have been hard on you." As she spoke, her eyes suddenly turned cold. "Just as you said, your E family has been offering tea for so many years and you've built many friendships. Yet, when you were in trouble, not a single person stood up for you. How infuriating." Exen sighed and said, "I did ask my father about this, but he also told me that this matter can't be blamed on anyone else." "What did he say?" Melaleuca japonica was surprised. "My father said that although our E family's tea is good, it's just a dispensable beverage. If you like it, you can drink it. If you don't, it's fine," Exen said. But when it happened, He's senior brother was a genius with a bright future. His master, Dukan Jinren, was a powerful Yuanning enlightened master and the first seat of the Heavenly Soldier Hall. He was highly respected in Kunlun, and even the enlightened master valued him. Under those circumstances, no one would go against them for some spiritual tea. My father said that it's hard to blame anyone. My father also said that our family's biggest sin is being too weak. Yen Luo was silent. After a while, she let out a long sigh. Suddenly, she laughed self-mockingly and said, "So, I am the most foolish one?" Xianxia left her seat and knelt in front of Melaleuca japonica. She kowtowed and said in a low voice, "Uncle Master, you saved me from danger. Xianxia cannot thank you enough. The entire E family is deeply indebted to you. In the future, if Uncle Master has any instructions, Xianxia will do her best, no matter." Yen Luo waved her hand to stop Xianxia from speaking. Then she pulled Xianxia up and said with a loving look in her eyes, "Just take care of yourself in the future. Furthermore, I'm not the only one who contributed to the outcome of that incident." Xianxia's expression changed slightly. She suddenly remembered what Lu Chen said to her. She was lost for a moment but recovered quickly. She smiled at Melaleuca japonica. "But you saved me. Don't worry, Uncle Master. No matter what happens next year, I'll definitely get you some little cranes." Melaleuca japonica laughed and pulled Xianxia to sit next to her. She sighed. "Speaking of which, it's all your cheap Master Dongfang's fault. He insisted on taking you as his disciple even before he recovered. In the end, he still can't come out from his closed-door training. He left you at Bai Chao Tang's place and let others bully you." Xianxia shook her head and smiled. "You can't say that. I'm indebted to my master. Without him, I wouldn't have been able to go to Kunlun." Pfft. Yen Luo spat in annoyance and said, "That unreliable old man has never done anything serious all day long. If it wasn't for him trying so hard to snatch you away, I would have been able to bring you up the mountain." Xianxia exclaimed. "Ah, really?" Melaleuca japonica rolled her eyes at her. "Nonsense. Do you think I'm stupid? Why would I stand up for Dukan Jinren and his talented disciple for no reason? It's because I can't take it." "Oh, thank you so much." Xianxia held Melaleuca japonica's hand and said with a smile, "It's a pity that our Kunlun party doesn't allow us to worship more than one master. Otherwise, I'd worship you as my master too." "You wish." Melaleuca japonica scolded with a smile. "But I've known that old man Dongfang Tao for many years. He's much stronger than me in terms of cultivation. If he didn't go into closed-door training to heal his injuries, I don't think those people would dare to bully you like this." Xianxia was taken aback. "Life and death are unpredictable? Isn't my master just recuperating in closed-door training?" Melaleuca japonica snorted, but there was a complicated look in the depths of her eyes. If it was just to heal his injuries, he should have come out long ago. But it took so long. There must be a problem. Xianxia was more and more surprised. "What problem?" Melaleuca japonica extended 2 fingers. "There are 2 possibilities. First, old man Dongfang's injuries are deeper and more serious than we know. Even he can't take it. If he hasn't fully recovered after so long, he's probably not far from death. Second," she shook her head, but lowered her voice and said to Xianxia, "I'm afraid he's found an opportunity. He's trying to break through to the Yuaning realm." Xianxia suddenly stood up and exclaimed, "Yuan!" Just as she said that, Melaleuca japonica had already covered her mouth with her palm and pulled her back. She glared at her and said, "Don't say anything." Xianxia's face was filled with disbelief. She was filled with excitement and nervousness. Even her body was trembling slightly. She nodded repeatedly. Melaleuca japonica then let go of her hand. Immediately after, Xianxia immediately covered her mouth with both hands, as if this was the only way to keep the secret. After a long while, she seemed to have calmed down a little. However, she still didn't dare to move her hands away from her mouth. Through the gaps between her fingers, she asked Melaleuca japonica in a trembling voice, "Senior Aunt, is this true?" Melaleuca japonica snorted. "I've already said that this is only my guess. However, I've known old man Dongfang for decades. I can tell what kind of person he is the moment he raises his butt. This time, it's most likely." Xianxia covered her mouth tightly and giggled foolishly. Even her eyes were squinting as she watched. Melaleuca japonica glanced at her and couldn't help but shake her head. She also laughed. If that old thing is lucky and really breaks through that life and death barrier and advances to the Yuanying realm, then your good days will come. A Yuanying stage Taoist master, who could summon the wind and rain, move mountains and fill the sea, had supernatural powers that could penetrate the heavens and the earth. Since ancient times, he had been an immortal class figure, standing at the top of the human cultivation world. However, such a person and such a realm, among the hundreds of millions of cultivators in the past thousands of years, only a very small number of people could reach this realm. This was because when one tried to break through to the Yuanying realm from the Jindan realm, there was an extremely dangerous life and death barrier that was extremely difficult to break through. When breaking through to the next realm, there would be the hindrance of the heart's devil from the outer realm. It was difficult to succeed unless one had great perseverance or strong luck. That's great. Xianxia was excited for a while. She couldn't help but worry. She quickly put her palms together and closed her eyes to pray to the heavens. She said, "May the heavens bless Master, bless that everything goes smoothly and that everything is stable and stable." Melaleuca japonica looked out of the quiet hall. Between the pine and cypress trees, the mountains in the distance could be faintly seen. The clouds were surrounded by celestial aura, but she didn't know who was hiding deep in the mountains. After a long time, Xianxia's voice suddenly came from beside her ear. She said, "Senior Aunt, I have a request." Chapter 112. What is it? Melaleuca japonica turned to Xianxia. Xianxia looked a little embarrassed but mustered her courage. "Martial Aunt, I heard that the candidates for the spirit cultivation team are about to be decided. How many people will be chosen this time?" Melaleuca japonica was taken aback. "Why are you asking?" Xianxia replied with an "oh," then stammered, "This? I have a friend who, also wants to be on this list." Melaleuca japonica smiled. "The spirit cultivation team accepts odd job disciples. Does your family have odd job disciples this year?" Xianxia quickly shook her head. No, it's just a friend I know. He's not from my family." She stole a glance at Melaleuca japonica. "I just wanted to ask if you could give him a chance." Melaleuca japonica looked at her with a faint smile. "Little girl, are you asking me to be biased?" Xianxia was startled and said, "Of course not, you've misunderstood. Isn't it stated in the rules that I, a direct disciple, also have the right to recommend candidates for the cultivation of spiritual power? That's why I'm recommending you." Melaleuca japonica thought for a moment. The candidates will be announced in 3 to 4 days. I remember it's already full." "Ah." Xianxia was shocked and disappointed. She mumbled, "Oh no. I'm too late. I came late." While speaking, her expression became a bit dejected, carrying a bit of pleading expression, just looking at Yen Luo. Melaleuca japonica looked at her and suddenly laughed. "Little girl, why are you acting so pitiful? Fine. You're about to become a perfected master's disciple. You'll be honored. Tell me your friend's name, and I'll see if I can put one in. But let me say this first, the cultivation of spiritual power has a requirement on the foundation of cultivation. If he can't pass the examination, then there's nothing we can do." Of course. Xianxia was overjoyed. She nodded and smiled. "Thank you for your kindness, Martial Aunt. My friend's name is Lu Chen." "Lu Chen?" Melaleuca japonica frowned. "Yes, that's right. Lu as in land, Chen as in dust, Lu Chen." Xianxia hurriedly repeated herself as if afraid that Yen Luo had misheard her. Melaleuca japonica nodded. "Okay, I'll remember it." Xianxia beamed with joy. She chatted with Melaleuca japonica for a while and then left. Yen Luo shook her head with a smile on her face as she watched the girl's back disappear from her line of sight. She sat there and thought for a moment. Then she suddenly stood up and went to a cabinet. She opened one of the drawers and found a book. At this moment, the smile on Yen Luo's face had disappeared. She picked up the scroll with an indifferent expression and flipped it open. Almost immediately, a piece of paper appeared on one of the pages. She opened the white paper and saw a few names written on it. Melaleuca japonica looked at the names one by one until her eyes stopped at the last name. Luchin was written on it. Melaleuca japonica stared at the two words and raised her eyebrows slightly. After a moment, she suddenly whispered to herself, "What is the background of this Luchin? Why are there so many people secretly helping him?" 3 days later, Luchin received a notice from Zhou Kuei, who was in charge of the odd job disciples. He was asked to go to the rock mountain to be inspected. At that time, he was still working in the spirit field. When he heard the news, he was a little surprised. But on the way to the hall on the mountain, he saw Xianxia waiting for him there with a smile on her face. He knew what was going on. On this day, the weather was fine and sunny. Xianxia stood under a verdant pine and cypress, smiling like a flower. Her youthful beauty attracted the attention of many odd job disciples along the way. Luchin deliberately lagged behind. When most of the others had passed, he walked up and whispered, "Is this Miss Yi's method?" Xianxia snorted and revealed a proud expression. She boasted, "What do you think? I'm not bad, right?" Luchin gave her a thumbs up and said, "You did what you said. Amazing." Xianxia covered her mouth and laughed. She looked very happy. Then she looked at the main hall in front of her and said in a low voice, "Don't be too happy too early. I heard that there will be about 50 people selected for the spiritual power cultivation this time. But just now, I saw that there were at least 60 people here. Don't be eliminated." Luchin smiled and said, "There shouldn't be a problem. Cultivating spiritual energy is all about using one's own spiritual energy to stimulate and cultivate some special spiritual plants. Among them, the most suitable are the wood and earth elements. Although my talent is poor, I have an earth element divine pillar on the 5 elements divine disc." Xianxia clapped her hands and said with a smile, "That's good. Anyway, you can pass the test. You go up. I will find a way to peep from the side later." Luchin laughed but did not say anything. He walked to the hall on the mountain. In the great hall of Rock Mountain, the 100 Herb Hall's odd job disciples were all gathered here. Luchin stood in the crowd and looked around. Sure enough, there was a huge crowd. There were indeed 60 to 70 people gathered here. Although there were many people here, the main hall was not noisy. The Kunlun sect was a place that attached great importance to rules. Even the handyman disciples had been taught many times after they entered the sect. No one dared to make noise here. After a while, the first group of people came out from the back of the hall. The leader was Jean Dan Friar Melaleuca Japonica. Behind her were 7 or 8 disciples. Some were in the foundation establishment realm, and some were in the chi refining realm. They all seemed to be talented personal disciples, and their status was much higher than that of the odd job disciples. Melaleuca Japonica did not reprimand them. When she came to the hall, she directly sat on the main seat. Naturally, someone stood up and spoke to everyone. She briefly explained that today's test was to see who was more suitable for the spirit cultivation. Martial Ant Melaleuca Japonica would personally supervise them. Next, the personal disciples walked down and divided the odd job disciples into several groups. They began the test. As for the test method, it was similar to the celestial inspection mirror that most people used when they entered the sect. It seemed that Xianxia was right. Bai Chao Tang was more concerned about the adaptability of the 5 elements. Luchin was assigned to one of the groups. Soon, he realized that the examination wasn't slow at all. One by one, those whose name was called stepped forward and placed their hands on the immortal inspection mirror's surface. The light reflected from the mirror would reflect the person's innate talent. Not long after, someone called his name. When the 2 words, Luchin, were called, Melaleuca Japonica, who was sitting at the top, glanced at him without batting an eyelid. In a corner at the back of the hall, Xianxia secretly poked her head out and looked over worriedly. Luchin walked over. He looked very calm. After placing his hands on the mirror, he closed his eyes and calmed himself down. Then, he began to circulate the spiritual energy in his body. Deep in the mountains, there was suddenly a muffled rumble of thunder. It sounded faintly from the clouds. Legend had it that some peerless geniuses would cause strange phenomena when they were appraising immortals. The heavens and the earth trembled. Rainbow light streaked across the sky. Dragons in the clouds and tigers in the fog. Auspicious beasts soared in the air. These were all magical phenomena that were rarely seen in the cultivation world. However, very few people had seen them before. This was because almost all of these phenomena belonged to the 5-pillar geniuses, who were 1 in 10,000. These lucky people seemed to be blessed by the heavens. Even when they were appraising immortals, their scenes were different. They were so high and mighty that people respected them. As for ordinary people, ordinary cultivators and disciples, they could at most possess a few rays of light that corresponded to the spiritual energy of the 5 elements. As for what was happening in this hall today, it was even more unlikely that there would be any accidents. This was because almost all the miscellaneous disciples were pillar disciples with the lowest talent. They only had 1 pitiful pillar in their spirit sea disk. They would only have 1 lonely ray of light that belonged to them. Most of them would only be able to communicate with 1 type of spiritual power in their entire lives. This would also directly limit the upper limit they could reach on the arduous and distant path of cultivation in the future. In the hall, the lonely and pure rays of light rose and fell. Everyone was silent, as if they were at the bottom of the world. They quietly accepted their fate and accepted this reality. Lu Chen placed his hand on the mirror. His expression was calm and natural. There was nothing out of the ordinary. There was no sign of nervousness either. He looked like an ordinary mortal who had already accepted his fate. The immortal inspection mirror began to tremble slightly. Zhou Kuei happened to be standing next to the immortal inspection mirror. His expression was solemn, but he was actually a little bored. In any case, it looked like a boring and monotonous object. Thus, he didn't have much of a reaction at first. He even forgot that when ordinary pillar disciples came to inspect it, the immortal inspection mirror would at most reflect light. There was no way it would tremble or anything like that. That moment was like a white steed flashing past a crevice. That moment was like a flash of lightning. That moment was like the blink of an eye. The immortal inspection mirror suddenly emitted a faint light. The faint light trembled like ripples on the surface of water. Several strange faint lights intertwined, forming an incomparably chaotic and strange graffiti-like image. Immediately after, in that indescribably minute instant, a smear of black suddenly spread out and erased all the light. The black was as deep as the sea. The black light was like an eternal and lonely night. However, a moment later, everything suddenly disappeared. As if a momentary blur, as if a passing cloud or a whirlwind, all the illusions were instantly annihilated without a sound. There was no faint light, no strange color, and no darkness. The immortal inspection mirror calmed down and returned to its normal state, as if nothing had happened. In that instant, everything was like a dream. No one had the time to remember or see that strange scene. The surface of the immortal inspection mirror slowly lit up with a yellow light. Lonely and bright. Zhou Kuei grunted in acknowledgement. He nodded and said, "The purity of the earth element spiritual energy is not bad." Chapter 113. The black dog ran happily in the mountains. There were almost no strong monsters in the mountains of Kunlun. Harmless birds and small animals could be seen everywhere in the mountains. The slightly larger and more powerful beasts were all hiding in the deep mountains and forests, not daring to come out easily. The only masters here were human beings. To be exact, they were the practitioners of the Kunlun party. Of course, Atsu didn't know the meaning of the phrase, a dog relying on its master's power, nor had it ever heard of such words. But these days, it really enjoyed playing in the mountains and forests near the Kunlun party Sherpan Mountain. Every time it went back home, it would be dark, so much so that Lu Chen scolded it several times, saying that it had become wild. Every time Lu Chen scolded it, Atsu would listen respectfully and resolutely not change its mind. It seemed that it especially liked the mountains and forests from the bottom of its heart. It liked to jump and run in the mountains, rivers, forests, and grasses. Every time this happened, Atsu would feel that its blood was boiling, and even its lame leg was no longer an obstacle. Sometimes, it even couldn't help but stand on the mountain and howl loudly and mournfully at the endless mountains and the clear sky. It was like a wolf on a full moon night. Well, it was just a little bit like a wolf. Its howl was not powerful enough, and the most important thing was that Atsu had never come out at night. When it was dark, it would obediently go home and stay with Lu Chen in that simple and narrow room. One day, Lu Chen went up the mountain, and Atsu ran alone to play. It ran through the mountains, ran through the rivers, ran through the mountains, and then saw a somewhat strange mountain. The mountain was hidden in the mountains of Kunlun. It was neither tall nor big. Standing at the foot of the mountain, Atsu felt that the mountain was a little strange. It was twisted and steep, and it seemed a little familiar. Atsu stared at it for a while. Suddenly, an idea popped into his head, and he found the answer. It felt that the shape of the mountain was like a dog's head. A mountain like a dog's head. Dog Head Mountain. Atsu immediately became excited. It barked at the mountain and ran over happily. But at the foot of the mountain, it suddenly stopped. It saw a naturally formed slope that occupied the entire side of the Dog Head Mountain and extended upwards. The slope, tiered by huge rocks and trees, was divided into a vast stairway, as if by some natural and conspicuous mark, which separated it from the rest of the world. A group of wild boars, a few goats, the occasional bird, and large herds of elk walked past it. Atsu, with some trepidation, kept a little distance from the tall animals, looked around, and went up the hill again. When they reached the second step of the invisible and huge staircase, Atsu suddenly saw a huge colorful tiger lying lazily under a tree, sleeping soundly. Atsu's legs immediately turned to jelly. Fortunately, the colorful tiger did not notice it. Atsu hurriedly ran to the side and unknowingly went up another step. Then, it seemed to feel something and subconsciously looked around. Sure enough, as it slowly walked up the mountain, there were actually different kinds of exotic beasts staying here on each step of the staircase. There was a huge crocodile that was 10 feet long, a pure white single-horned rhinoceros, a flying black golden eagle, and even an auspicious spirit crane. Layer by layer, invisible lines seemed to be drawn on the mountain, allowing all the exotic beasts to live in harmony. What was strange was that they didn't seem to attack other animals. At most, they would roar in Atsu's direction in a threatening manner, and then Atsu would be so scared that he would piss his pants and flee. Although Atsu was a little afraid, for some reason, there seemed to be a strange impulse in its heart that kept encouraging it, making it look up at the highest point of the mountain. Vaguely, there seemed to be a huge figure there. Atsu slowly approached that place. When it reached the top of the mountain, the black dog's legs were already trembling, and it looked like it could not hold on any longer. But soon, it saw what it wanted to see. On the peak of this Dog Head Mountain, there was indeed a huge figure lying on the ground. When that huge pair of eyes slowly looked towards Atsu, Atsu suddenly cried out in joy. Then, it rushed over and happily cried at the huge beast that was the size of a small hill, wagging its tail with all its might. It was as if it had seen an old friend that it missed very much and wanted to please very much. It was an oxen, occupying the top of this mountain, the top of all the auspicious beasts of Mount Kunlun. Oxen glanced at Atsu, and Atsu barked happily, but there was no reaction from Oxen. After a moment, suddenly, Oxen swung its tail and stretched out, like the legendary immortal binding rope, instantly wrapping around Atsu's body, then threw it into the air and immediately flew far away. Woof! There was a shrill cry, and countless beasts on and above the Dog's Head Mountain heard the sound and looked over. They saw a black shadow flying down from the mountain, flipping several times in the air, then with a muffled thud, fell into a dense forest at the foot of the mountain, and did not move for a long time. It was deathly silent up and down the mountain. After a short while, everything suddenly returned to normal. All the beasts ate, slept, and took a stroll. However, not a single one of them came over to take a look at the reckless black dog. 5 days later, Bai Chao Tang officially announced the list of disciples for this year's spiritual power training. There were 50 people, and Lu Chen's name was among them. Xian was very happy and ran over to celebrate with Lu Chen, but Lu Chen spoiled the mood by telling her that they were even from now on, and that she did not owe him any favors, which made Xian roll her eyes for a while. But that was nothing. When Xian saw the dirty black dog lying in the room with several bandages on its body, she was shocked and immediately asked Lu Chen about it. Lu Chen did not know either. He only said that the stupid dog crawled all the way back from the forest a few days ago, and it looked very miserable. It seemed that when it was playing in the forest, It accidentally fell somewhere and broke several bones. It took Lu Chen a lot of effort to put it back together. Exen was so distressed that she hugged Atsu with tears streaming down her face. She comforted it softly for a while, and then ran out to buy a big bag of meat and bones, which was Atsu's favorite, and put it in front of Atsu to heal and replenish its chi and blood. The strange thing was, although Atsu was seriously injured, he didn't seem to have too many strange emotions. He ate and slept. When Exen came, he stuck his tongue out at her and licked her watch. Other than that, he didn't do anything else. So in the end, Exen could only think that Atsu accidentally fell and broke it. Then she told Atsu for a long time, which made it listless, yawn, and finally fall asleep in her arms. Compared to Exen's soft-hearted nature, Lu Chen was much more straightforward. After helping Atsu connect its bones, changing the medicine and bandaging it, he kicked it to the corner of the room. In his words, this stupid dog was useless and always caused trouble for him. Sooner or later, it would be better to stew it and eat it. Exen was so angry that she held Atsu and wanted to leave. However, Atsu was very affectionate with her, but when it was time to leave, it became merciless and hugged the corner of the table and stool, refusing to leave the room even if it died. In the end, it hid behind Lu Chen, and no matter what Exen said, it would not come out. What kind of dog was this? Exen was about to lose all hope in this strange and rebellious black dog. She felt like she was about to break down. Anyway, Atsu was just an inconspicuous episode. Lu Chen's days in the Kunlun party continued as usual. After participating in the cultivation of spiritual power, the spiritual field could be put aside. Under the arrangement of the Baichao Tang, Lu Chen and 50 other handyman disciples who had good spiritual power left the rock mountain and came to another place under the Baichao Tang called Fragrant Garden. Fragrant Garden was a garden for planting important mystical materials. It covered a large area, but Lu Chen and other handyman disciples were only allowed to work in the outermost, Maple Garden, for the time being. The worst mystical materials that could be planted in Fragrant Garden were at least 2 veined. The deeper one went, the higher the grade. The fragrant spiritual chi lingered all day long, so it got the name Fragrant Garden. The work of Lu Chen and other disciples was in the outermost Maple Garden. In some spiritual plants arranged by the Herb Garden, they used their spiritual power to adjust the spiritual power of the 5 elements in the soil of the surrounding spiritual fields, so that these precious mystical materials could grow better. This was a very boring but very serious work. If one was not careful, it was very likely to hurt the fragile roots of the spiritual plants, and then damage the mystical materials. If cultivated properly, these precious spiritual plants would grow better than under normal circumstances, and the spiritual power and medicinal power contained in them would be more abundant. This was what Lu Chen did. When he was working, he looked like most people, a little funny and a little ridiculous. The handyman disciples all squatted in the spiritual fields with their hands inserted into the ground. Some of them even stuck their buttocks up. Then, they held their breath and carefully activated the spiritual power in the soil. Rays of weak light flashed in the soil. After a day, their bodies and faces would often be stained with black soil, looking a little dirty. They looked like the most ordinary farmers in the secular world. That day, Lu Chen squatted in the spiritual fields, doing his own work. There were a lot of Kunlun disciples coming and going in the flowing fragrance garden. Many of them were here to consume medicine, and there were also some who came to the 100 Herb Hall to purchase panacea pills. There were also some who directly spent spirit stones to ask the people of the 100 Herb Hall to help them plant some precious spiritual herbs and spiritual materials. When those high and mighty Kunlun disciples passed by, most of them would not look at those handyman disciples who bowed their heads like farmers. Occasionally, there would be curious young people who looked at these people, and then let out surprised and funny sounds, saying something like, "Those people look like toads," and so on. Of course, Lu Chen also heard some of these words, but his face was always calm, and no one could see any fluctuations in his heart. However, in the evening of that day, when he finally finished all his work and stood up with his back aching, he suddenly saw a beautiful figure in the distance, with her back facing him, walking towards the depths of Fragrant Garden. Under the evening glow of that day, The scarlet feather cloak on her shoulders was like the burning clouds in the sky. Chapter 114. That woman's name was Su Qingjun. Lu Chen knew her name and knew that she was a talented disciple of the Kunlun party. At a young age, she was only one step away from the realm of Jin Dan. She also had a famous and powerful master, Yuanin Jinren. Even because she was born in Tetsu, which was the weaker side, her master, Masato Kihara, and other elders of Tetsu had secretly pinned the hope of Tetsu's future rise on her. She was a proud daughter of heaven, a top genius of the Four Pillars, and one of the most dazzling young geniuses of the Kunlun party. In terms of momentum, she was even better than he. An odd-job disciple like Lu Chen could only quietly watch her back from afar. The difference between them was like the difference between heaven and earth. Perhaps only the beautiful red feather cloak, which was like a burning flame, could make him feel a little familiar. It reminded him of the small mountain village, the mountain, and the swallows in the mountain. Lu Chen watched the woman's figure walk into the depths of the fragrance garden and disappear. Then he silently turned around and left. After entering the list of spiritual power cultivators and coming to work in the fragrance garden, Lu Chen's residence was also moved here. Compared to the previous house in the Stone Pan Valley, his current residence was obviously better. First of all, the space was half as wide, the house was much brighter, and there was a lot more furniture. There was even a desk in front of the window. Perhaps it was because of these intangible benefits that so many odd-job disciples flocked to it. When Lu Chen returned to his house, the sky was already dark. He pushed open the door, and a black shadow flashed. Atsu greeted him. Atsu was a hybrid descendant of two kinds of monsters. Although it seemed that its combat power was very poor and it was very sorry to its parents, its recovery speed was very good. When it was first rescued in the Land of Chaos, Atsu's broken leg healed much faster than Xianxia's broken hand. It was the same now. A few days ago, he had broken a bone somewhere, but now it was almost healed. Lu Chen squatted down and patted Atsu's head. Atsu wagged its tail and barked at him twice before looking out the door. Do you want to go out and play? Lu Chen asked. Atsu wagged its tail even more excitedly. Lu Chen smiled and said, "You're not afraid of anything. You just broke your bones and now you don't remember?" Woof 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 woof. Atsu snorted softly, as if it didn't care at all. "All right." Lu Chen laughed and said, "Do whatever you want. I don't care if you want to be wild, but don't give me any more trouble. Also, it's dark now, and there's a curfew outside. You can't go out at night. Let's wait until tomorrow." As he said this, he turned around and closed the door. Because it was dark and there was no light in the room, the surroundings suddenly became dark, and only the outline of some furniture could be seen. Lu Chen walked to the bed and sat down, and Atsu followed. In the darkness, Atsu's eyes began to gradually shine. It was a strange gaze with a little green, shining in the dark. It was a little scary, a little gloomy, and a little strangely beautiful, like a pure and clear emerald. Lu Chen looked at Atsu's eyes for a while, then looked away, lying on the bed, and then quietly stopped moving. After a while, there was a rustling sound on the bed. Atsu also jumped onto the bed, then quietly lay down next to Lu Chen. Its body curled up into a ball, and the two green spots in its eyes slowly disappeared, as if it had closed its eyes. The night was dark, and time passed little by little. Finally, it was late at night, and there was no sound inside or outside the room. Then, in the darkness, Lu Chen, who had been quietly lying on the bed, suddenly opened his eyes. There was no change in his breathing and his heartbeat compared to before. Even the most sensitive peeper would have a hard time noticing the difference. In this darkness where he couldn't even see his own fingers, his pupils seemed to have merged with the surrounding darkness. Like a quietly burning black flame. Inside and outside the room, it was quiet. After waiting for a long time, he slowly raised his right hand and reached for his heart. Seeing that his palm was about to touch his chest, suddenly, another strange arm stretched out from the darkness and pressed on the back of his hand. Lu Chen turned his eyes to look. Two balls of green flames slowly lit up in the darkness, right beside him. And the hand that pressed on the back of his hand just now was a front paw of Atsu. Lu Chen was not surprised, nor did he panic. He just quietly looked at the strange eyes of Atsu in the darkness. After a while, he suddenly smiled and whispered, "Do you want to go too?" Atsu whispered as if it was a response. "Okay," Lu Chen said, then stretched out his other hand and held Atsu's body in his arms. In this process, Atsu was very cooperative and did not struggle at all. From its body came a warm body temperature, adding some warmth to the somewhat cold night. In the darkness, Lu Chen hugged Atsu, then put his right hand on his chest again, took a deep breath, and suddenly pressed down. The familiar feeling of floating and sinking suddenly hit him, and there was a roar in his ears, which seemed to be far and near. That moment seemed to be extraordinarily long, but after a moment, when Lu Chen inadvertently saw light in front of his eyes, his body had already changed places. Lu Chen and Atsu fell on the ground of the tree hole. Of course, this fall was not serious, nor was it painful. At least, Atsu jumped up, then ran to the side excitedly, and began to smell around curiously. Lu Chen sat up from the ground and glanced at his surroundings. He had not been in this tree hole for a long time. The reason was, of course, the last time when he fought with White Lotus, the girl's sacred tree branch suddenly had a strange resonance with the seed on his body, and then both of them, including Atsu, were sucked into this place. Fortunately, on that day, White Lotus was suppressed by some kind of power and had been unconscious in this tree hole, so she did not discover Lu Chen's biggest secret. Compared to the past, this tree hole had undergone great changes. The ancient mottled tree wall had regained some vitality, and the hazy green gas that wandered and entangled in the tree lines was also a lot denser. Lu Chen even saw some green buds on some of the tree wall that looked like burls on the branches. All of this, of course, was due to the essence that he squeezed out from the sacred tree branch that day. However, that was said to be the only branch of the sacred tree in the world. At that time, Lu Chen felt that the essence of life contained in it was as vast and endless as the ocean. Only that kind of incomparably abundant energy could revitalize this ancient tree hole. Among all the changes brought about by the Tree of God's essence, the one that attracted Lu Chen's attention the most was not the changes on the tree wall in the ancient tree hole, but the silhouettes of two doors that suddenly appeared in the depths of the ancient tree wall, one in front and one behind. It was really just the outline, because even if Lu Chen walked close and touched it with his hand, he could not find any gap at all. The two doors were like mysterious things hidden behind the hazy green gas and mottled bark. They could be seen but not touched and could not be opened. Lu Chen tried many methods, but it was useless. Even if he tried to recall what he saw and heard when he lived in the devil cult, including all the legends of the devil cult that he had heard and seen, he had never seen anything similar to these two doors. The door was meant to be opened, so what was the world behind the door? Lu Chen subconsciously thought back to that day. In his memory, the sky was filled with starlight and the seemingly boundless dark void. He suddenly felt a little cold. Woof 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 woof. A burst of barking came from the side, and Lu Chen was awakened from his contemplation. He looked back and saw that Atsu had run to the side of the pond in the middle of the tree hole. It was lying on the side, carefully looking into the water, and occasionally barking into the water, as if it was a little nervous. Lu Chen walked over and looked into the water. He saw that Atsu's shadow was reflected in the water, and could not help but laugh. "Don't make a fuss, that's your own shadow." Atsu raised his head to look at Lu Chen. He snorted twice in a low voice, then suddenly raised his head to shout into the water. Woof 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 woof. Lu Chen was a little surprised and walked closer. He followed Atsu's gaze, and saw that the black dog was lying on the side of the water, but its gaze seemed to pass through the reflection in the water, looking deeper into the clear water. He suddenly fell silent. He silently looked at Atsu, watching the dog that seemed to be nervous, and even the hair on its neck was slightly standing up. After a while, he walked over, squatted down beside Atsu, and hugged its head. In his arms, perhaps because it felt the familiar warmth and smell, Atsu quickly calmed down, no longer barking and nervous, and its body also relaxed. "It's okay," Lu Chen whispered to it, "it's just an annoying fire." Atsu did not answer, nor did it respond, but still quietly leaned against him. Lu Chen looked down, and through the water, he saw that in the depths of the clear water, behind the sparkling and swaying waves, a shadow gradually emerged. It was a black fire burning silently in the depths of the water. But the next moment, Lu Chen's pupils suddenly contracted. The black fire seemed to be a little bigger than in his memory. The black fire burned silently, and this familiar scene seemed to never disappear from his memory, like a demon forever engraved in the deepest part of his memory. Lu Chen slowly raised his head, frowned, and looked around at the ancient tree hole that seemed to be showing signs of life. He suddenly thought, in this vibrant place, could it be that the mysterious black fire also absorbed the power of life essence and slowly grew like this tree hole? Could it be that the black fire, like this ancient tree hole, had some kind of unimaginable life? Chapter 115. Half a month later, the group of 50 handyman disciples who came to the fragrance garden began to show their superiority in terms of spiritual energy cultivation, and Bai Chao Tang quickly divided them into two groups. There were 40 people on one side and 10 on the other. In the group with fewer people, the effect of spiritual energy cultivation was very outstanding. The spiritual plants cultivated by them grew much better than ordinary spiritual plants, and they even bloomed and bore fruit a day or two faster than the others. In the group with more people, most of the effects were more ordinary. Lu Chen was placed on the side where there were fewer people but had remarkable results. Although he only had one divine pillar of 5 elements of earth, and could only use the earth element spiritual power, the earth element spiritual power he absorbed and used was extremely pure, and the spirit herbs cultivated by him grew especially lush. He was one of the few people who had the best results. In the following time, the 40 handyman disciples were still working in the same place, while the 10 people led by Lu Chen were taken to another place in the fragrance garden, a place called Grass Garden. Compared with the original maple garden, the spiritual plants planted in the grass garden were obviously of a higher grade. There were almost no common two-stripe spiritual plants in the garden, and the ones that did appear were the most precious two-stripe spiritual materials. In addition, half of the area was already planted with 3-stripe spiritual plants. The heritage of a 5,000-year famous sect was inadvertently revealed in such a place. Even though Lu Chen had a rich history in the past, at this moment, when he looked at this herb garden and thought of the higher-grade places in the depths of the fragrance garden, he could not help but be amazed. After arriving at the grass garden, Bai Chao Tang's attitude toward these 10 people also began to change, and more or less valued them. At the same time, because of the value of the spiritual plants in the grass garden, they were more attentive to Lu Chen and the others. Unlike in the maple garden, each of them was assigned a piece of land to take care of many spiritual plants. Here, they were ordered to take care of only one spiritual plant, and for each kind of spiritual plant, there was a person who came to carefully explain to them the precautions and methods of cultivating this kind of spiritual plant. In the end, even Melaleuca japonica, Jean Dan Friar, appeared here and personally exhorted them, telling them clearly that the spiritual plants here were invaluable, and in a sense, even more valuable than the handyman disciples. All the handyman disciples listened quietly, no one refuted, and no one resisted. Melaleuca japonica relaxed her expression, and then she told everyone in a pleasant manner that even so, if they took good care of the precious spiritual plants here, the harvest would be far greater than in the Stone Valley, and the hope of cultivation in the future would greatly increase. Lu Chen stood in the crowd and looked at the smiling old woman with white hair and a ruddy complexion. He thought to himself, what a good painting! As the disciple with the purest cultivation method and the most outstanding cultivation effect among this batch of handyman disciples, Lu Chen was assigned a very precious 3-stripe spiritual plant, red ambergris. Red ambergris was an extremely precious spiritual plant, even among the 3-stripe spiritual plants, and its nature was very strange. On an acre of land, only one red ambergris could grow, and there had never been a situation where 2 could grow side by side. Not only that, on the land where the red ambergris grew, there would always only be a special kind of grass called ginseng grass growing around it, and no other trees, flowers, or plants would be able to survive. Even the trees that were deliberately transplanted near the red ambergris would wither and die on their own not long after. This was a very tyrannical spiritual plant, and it even did not hesitate to rob the lives of other plants to ensure its own space to grow. But at the same time, because of the amazing medicinal power of the red ambergris, it had a wide range of uses in the path of refining panaceas. Thus, for many years, the wild red ambergris had almost been dug out completely. Only a famous sect with a deep foundation like the Kunlun party had the ability to plant it themselves. When Lu Chen saw the red ambergris, he discovered that it was on an acre of land. In the center of the green grass, there was a spiritual plant with 9 tiny red ginseng ears, and it was particularly eye-catching. The red ambergris was a bit taller than the surrounding grass called ginseng grass, and it looked a little like a crane in a flock of chickens. But unlike its tyrannical growth habits, the red ambergris on the ground was actually quite delicate and cute. It had green stems and leaves that were more than a foot tall, and its color was tender. There were red ginseng ears on the top of its head, and there were 9 bright red fruits on the top of its head. They were full and bright red, giving people the urge to take a bite. Lu Chen looked at the red fruits for a while, then stretched out his hands and pressed them on the ground around the red ambergris, slowly inhaling and exhaling. A bright earthy yellow light bloomed from the ground, and the grains of soil seemed to tremble slightly. Then, very obediently, they moved closer to the red ambergris under Lu Chen's control. At the same time, under the ground that was invisible to the naked eye, the earth's spiritual power deep in the soil was also continuously gathering towards the roots of this spiritual plant. The red ambergris on the ground trembled in the wind, as if it was extremely happy. Even its stems and leaves danced with the wind, and after a while, the colors of the fruits on its head seemed to become brighter. Lu Chen withdrew his hands and exhaled. He stood up and walked around nearby, looking quite relaxed. About 100 feet away from his piece of land, there were a few other pieces of land where the other odd job disciples were cultivating other spiritual plants. When Lu Chen looked at them, he found that most of the odd job disciples were very cautious and careful. They were working diligently and didn't dare to be distracted in the slightest. Lu Chen smiled, shook his head, and withdrew his gaze. Then he found a flat piece of land and directly lay down. There were green and soft ginseng grass everywhere around the red ambergris. It was a bit like a green blanket, and Lu Chen was very comfortable lying on it. He closed his eyes and laid down leisurely for a while. Suddenly, he felt that the light in front of him seemed to dim, and a shadow stood in front of him. Then, a voice came. The voice was pleasant, but seemed to be slightly angry. "Who are you? How dare you be so lazy? The red ambergris is a rare spiritual material. If something happens to it, what punishment will you bear?" Lu Chen opened his eyes and saw a figure standing beside him. The figure blocked the light from the sky, and for a moment, he couldn't see the person's face clearly. But in that instant, he still saw the beautiful scarf on the person's shoulder like a burning flame. Lu Chen sat up, then patted his buttocks and stood up. Only then did he raise his eyes to look at the woman in front of him. This was an extremely beautiful woman. Her eyebrows were like a painting, and her skin was whiter than snow. She carried a long sword on her back. Although the scabbard was simple and unadorned, there was a kind of faint, fierce aura coming from it. It was obviously not an ordinary item. It could even be a famous ancient sword with a great origin. And on her shoulder, now that he looked closer, Lu Chen could more clearly see the scarlet, bright, and gorgeous feathers on the shawl. It was the scarlet feather that he had seen at the edge of the sky pit in the mountain behind the small village. "Su Qingjun." He smiled, took a step back, and said with a calm and gentle expression, "Greetings, Shiji Su." Su Qingjun frowned, feeling slightly surprised. She said, "You know me?" Lu Chen's expression did not change. He said, "Senior sister, you have an illustrious reputation in the Kunlun party. There is no one who does not know of you." Su Qingjun snorted, but did not say anything. She only looked at Lu Chen and said, "You are the odd job disciple who was sent to cultivate the red ambergris ginseng, right? This is such an important spiritual material. How dare you be so negligent? Are you not afraid that if the teachers of Baichao Tang see you like this, they will severely punish you?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment. He suddenly said, "If I remember correctly, Shiji Su, you should not be under Baichao Tang, right?" Yes, why do you ask this? Lu Chen sighed and said, I was indeed arranged to cultivate this red ambergris ginseng, but I don't seem to have done anything wrong before. Perhaps you, Shiji Su, just saw me lying on the ground resting, and you find it a little unpleasant to the eye? Su Qingjuan's expression darkened. She looked at this man more and more disliked him in her heart. But at this moment, when her eyes swept over this person's face, she suddenly felt a vague sense of familiarity. It was as if she had seen him before, but she could not remember at the moment. She was also too lazy to think so much. She only said coldly, I am not under Bai Chao Tang, so naturally I will not meddle in other people's business. But this red ambergris ginseng is the one that grows the best and matures the fastest in the garden. It is of great use to me, so naturally I cannot allow you to casually trample on it. Only then did Lu Chen understand and said, so this red ambergris ginseng was decided by you. Su Qingjuan's first reaction was to nod, but suddenly she felt that there seemed to be something wrong with this person's words. It sounded a little awkward, but she just could not say anything, so she became more and more angry. With a cold face, she said, don't talk nonsense with me. I only ask you, since Bai Chao Tang asked you to cultivate this red ambergris ginseng, why didn't you work hard? If the efficacy of the elixir deteriorates because of this in the future, wouldn't it be your fault? Lu Chen thought for a moment, and said, Shiji Su, what are you trying to do by saying so much? Su Qingjun said, work hard and cultivate this red ambergris ginseng, otherwise I will not let you off easily. Lu Chen raised his eyebrows and said, that's strange. Where did you see that I didn't work hard and didn't cultivate this red ambergris ginseng? As he spoke, he looked at Su Qingjun with a faint smile on his face, and the look in the depths of his eyes seemed to be a little strange. Su Qingjun was an extremely intelligent woman. When she said this, she already faintly felt that something was wrong. She was usually obsessed with cultivation, and was not proficient in cultivating elixirs. The red ambergris ginseng was an important spiritual material that she needed today, but apart from its efficacy, she really knew nothing about how to cultivate this kind of elixir. Looking at the man in front of her who seemed to have something to rely on, Su Qingjun faintly felt that she might have said something wrong. It was just that she had always been used to being aloof. Everyone saw that she had outstanding talent and beautiful appearance, and on the surface, they mostly gave in to her. Very few people would speak to her face like this. And at this moment, Lu Chen did not even wait for Su Qingjun to think further. He stood there and said, right, Shi Su, just now you said that you will not let me off easily. What do you mean by that? Chapter 116. When Lu Chen said this, he looked directly at Su Qingjun, and there was a hint of provocation in his words. However, looking at his calm expression and tone, he didn't seem to have any such intention. Su Qingjun obviously didn't seem to be a hot-tempered person. She didn't react to Lu Chen's words. Instead, she frowned and asked, from what you're saying, did I say something wrong just now? Tell me. If I'm wrong, I'll naturally apologize to you. Lu Chen was also startled by her words. He couldn't help but size up Su Qingjun again, looking at her with a whole new level of respect. It had been some time since Lu Chen joined the Kunlun party, so he had some understanding of this woman who was quite famous in the sect. In addition, in Kunwa City, Old Ma also privately inquired about a lot of information about Su Qingjun and passed it on to him. In fact, at this moment, Lu Chen knew a bit more about Su Qingjun than most people. No matter which aspect this young and beautiful woman was seen from, the word perfect seemed to be written on her body. She was very talented and was born to be a top genius of the 4 pillars. In terms of cultivation, she advanced very quickly, far surpassing ordinary people. She came from a good family, born in the largest aristocratic family in Kunwa City, the Su family. Since she was a child, she had been doted on by thousands of people. Heavenly treasures and delicacies were piled up like mountains. She had a deep background. In addition to the countless overt and covert forces the Su family had in the Kunlun party, her master was the leader of the Iron Branch of the Kunlun party. Even if the Iron Branch was currently weak, if the hope of the entire branch was entrusted to one person, no one in the Kunlun branch would dare to rashly provoke her. At such a young age, she even saw the glittering golden gate of the Jin Dan realm. Her future path was even more profound and broad beyond imagination. It was even rumored that Su Qingjuan's master, the wine-loving Taoist Master Muyuan, had once let slip in his drunken stupor that his disciple might have a chance to pry into the legendary true sovereign realm in the future. Of course, this was only a rumor that couldn't be verified. Masato Kihara also firmly denied that she had said such a thing many times in the future. However, similar rumors didn't stop and quietly spread among the disciples of the Kunlun party. She seemed to have been born to stand above all living beings, and should have been revered and looked up to by all mortals. Yet, at this moment, she was suddenly able to say that she was sorry to Lu Qin. Lu Qin carefully looked at her eyes. The woman's eyes were clear and bright, as if there were no impurities, which made people subconsciously feel that all of what she said was true. Su Qingjun waited for a while and found that Lu Qin was only looking at her without replying. She couldn't help but frown and slightly raised her voice to call out. However, looking at her appearance, it was obvious that this girl had received the best etiquette since she was young. Perhaps it was because she was too beautiful and her temperament was too outstanding, so even if it was such a hurried call, it didn't make people feel uncomfortable. Lu Qin withdrew his gaze and laughed self-deprecatingly in his heart. He thought to himself, the gap between people is really big. After a pause, he pointed at the red amber ginseng on the ground and said to Su Qingjun, "Shiji Su, the cultivation of this red amber ginseng is particular about the 1/9 division. In other words, 1 part is cultivated and 9 parts is nurtured. As long as you do your part well and gather the earth attribute spiritual power in the spiritual field around the red amber ginseng root, the rest of the time, you just need to let it grow on its own." Su Qingjun looked a little surprised and said, "Is that so?" Lu Qin said, "This method was passed down from generations of ancestors in Baichao Tang. Of course, I, a servant disciple, wouldn't dare to change it. If Shiji doesn't believe me, you can also go to Baichao Tang and ask." Su Qingjun nodded and said, "So that's how it is." After a pause, she said with some doubt, "According to what you said, this red amber ginseng seems to be very easy to cultivate? But in the past, when I went to Baichao Tang to look for this spiritual material, they all said that it was difficult to cultivate and very rare." Lu Qin smiled and said, "That's right. The Shiji brothers and sisters in Baichao Tang didn't lie to you. The red amber ginseng is indeed not easy to cultivate." As he said that, he squatted down and fiddled with the soil particles next to the red amber ginseng. He crushed a small piece of soil and said, "Although the red amber ginseng is idle most of the time when it is cultivated, the most important part of the time is that the spiritual power in the soil must be mobilized at a uniform speed and must be carefully returned to all the thin roots of the spiritual grass in the soil. At the same time, the earth attribute spiritual power absorbed and mobilized must be pure and gentle. Ordinary people can't do this step. It's not that the quality of the spiritual power is not high enough, it's that the control of cultivation is not good enough. It's that the red amber ginseng is one of the most difficult spiritual grass to cultivate." Su Qingjun glanced at Lu Qin and suddenly said, "So, among this year's servant disciples, you are very good at cultivating spiritual power?" Lu Qin said, "I am the best, so the Shiji brothers in Baichao Tang asked me to cultivate this red amber ginseng." Su Qingjun was startled. She didn't expect that Lu Qin would be so rude and modest, which was different from the people she usually knew. For a moment, she couldn't help but find it funny. She shook her head and smiled, saying, "You are actually so confident?" Lu Qin smiled and didn't answer. Su Qingjun didn't look at him anymore. Her bright eyes were slightly bright as she stared at the red amber ginseng with 9 red pearls on its head. There was curiosity and joy in her eyes, as if she was very happy that she had just learned a new kind of knowledge. After a moment, she suddenly squatted down as well. She didn't seem to care about the dirt of the soil in the spiritual field and used her white fingers to gently touch the red amber ginseng. The creation of the boundless world is mysterious. Even this little spiritual herb has such knowledge. It is really amazing. She had a smile on her face, but she softly praised. After a moment, the two stood up together. Su Qingjun turned around and was about to leave when she suddenly stopped and looked back at Lu Chen. Lu Chen slightly lowered his head and said, "Shiji Su, is there anything else?" Su Qingjun looked at him and said, "Just now, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know the habits of the red amber ginseng, so I rashly criticized you. It was my fault." Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, "Shiji Su, with your identity, you actually don't need to apologize to me." Su Qingjun lightly said, "If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. There is no need to cover it up. But then again, this red amber ginseng is really important to me. I hope you, I haven't asked for your name." Lu Chen. "Yes, junior brother Lu, please take good care of this spiritual herb. If it matures and its medicinal power is abundant, I will definitely reward you." Lu Chen smiled and said, "Senior sister, don't worry." Su Qingjun nodded and pondered for a moment, then said, "There is one more thing. Consider it me saying too much. Perhaps the red amber ginseng is like this, and you also did your part. But lying down and sleeping casually in the spiritual field, no matter who saw it, inevitably gave people the impression that you are lazy and cunning. It is absolutely not good for you." Lu Chen took a deep look at this beautiful woman, then immediately nodded and said, "I understand. Thank you for the advice, senior sister." Su Qingjun made a sound of N and didn't say anything else. She turned around and left this spiritual field. A gentle breeze blew from afar, fluttering her thin and beautiful clothes. The fiery red scarlet feather shawl trembled on her shoulders, like a magnificent burning scene, stunning the passage of time under the light of the sky. When Lu Chen was caught slacking off in the fragrance garden, Atsu, who had almost recovered from his injuries, ran out of the house and went out to play. The surroundings of the new house were, of course, not the same as the one in the Stone Pan Valley. But because they were all in the mountains of Kunlun, most of the places were still mountains and forests. Therefore, it didn't take much effort for Atsu to get used to the surroundings. Then, it went into the forest around the fragrance garden to play. Compared to the freedom in the Stone Pan Valley, the forest around the fragrance garden was obviously much more vigilant. Needless to say, there were always people patrolling the periphery of the herb garden. Even in the forest, one could occasionally see 1 or 2 teams of patrolling disciples passing by. Obviously, the Baichao Tang still valued this piece of land very much. Although Atsu wasn't a particularly powerful demon beast and didn't have any powerful abilities, its nose was very sensitive. In addition, its movements were considered agile, so it was very comfortable in the forest. When it encountered the disciples on guard, it would avoid them and there were no accidents. Everything looked normal and happy. Unfortunately, Atsu found that after searching for a long time, it still couldn't find the strange Dog-Head Mountain from that day. But this was actually normal. There was a distance from the Stone Pan Mountain to the Fragrance Garden. Moreover, the mountains of Kunlun were so big. The Dog-Head Mountain was hidden in the mountains, so it was really not easy to find it in a short period of time. But for some reason, Atsu still couldn't forget about the Dog-Head Mountain. Even when it was thrown off the mountain and injured, Atsu still wanted to go and take a look. Walking and running, Atsu still didn't find anything after crossing mountains and rivers. Seeing that it was getting late, Atsu could only turn around and go back. Anyway, there was still a long way to go. It would slowly find the Dog-Head Mountain in the future. The way home was not difficult for it. Following the smell, Atsu walked back. Seeing that the sky was gradually getting darker, Atsu also walked close to the fragrance garden. But at this moment, Atsu's body suddenly trembled and it suddenly stopped in its tracks. In the forest ahead, in the dim light, a huge figure suddenly appeared there. It was that oxen. Atsu stopped in its tracks and stared at the bull from afar. There was some doubt in its eyes. It quickly found that oxen seemed to be standing in the forest, looking at something from afar. Atsu followed the green ox's gaze and saw that in front of the green ox, under the mountain forest, was the vast flowing fragrance garden. Pieces of neatly shaped spiritual fields were neatly arranged in the herb garden. Waves of fragrance of spiritual herbs and spiritual grasses, in this night breeze, faintly drifted in this mountain forest, and diffused. Atsu looked at oxen. Oxen let out a low, moo sound. It raised its head and deeply sniffed the air. Then, a trace of an intoxicated expression appeared on its face. Chapter 117. Atsu stayed in the forest about 100 feet away from Oxen, watching the huge beast from afar. Of course, at the same time, it also saw Oxen's strange movements and expression. Its eyes were filled with confusion, and it couldn't help but raise its head and sniff the air a few times. A dog's nose was very sensitive, so Atsu easily smelled the fragrance of elixirs drifting over from the direction of the herb garden. The smell was very pleasant, and it was slightly different from the usual fragrance. However, after sniffing it, Atsu only felt that although the fragrance was not bad, it wasn't to the point where it would be intoxicated by it. It became more and more curious and didn't go forward at that moment. Instead, it hid in the forest and watched Oxen. It saw Oxen standing in the forest for a long time, an intoxicated expression appearing on its face from time to time, and it often looked in the direction of the flowing fragrance garden with a hint of desire in its eyes. However, from the beginning to the end, Atsu didn't see Oxen take a step in that direction. About an hour later, Oxen seemed to be satisfied, and it suddenly turned and strode away, leaving this place. Atsu was shocked, and after a moment of hesitation, it still chased after Oxen from a distance. Along the way, Oxen didn't look back once. It was unknown whether it didn't notice that Atsu was following it, or whether it didn't care about the little black dog that was as small as an ant. Atsu didn't think too much about it, and just followed Oxen. It didn't know how long it had been walking in the mountains, but suddenly, the view in front of it widened, and a strangely shaped mountain peak appeared in front of it. It was a mountain that looked a little like a dog's head. Dog Head Mountain. Atsu finally found the path that led to this place. Oxen slowly walked up the mountain, ignoring all the immortal birds and ferocious beasts at the foot and halfway up the mountain. And when they saw this oxen, all the animals immediately showed respect and humility, as if in this Kunlun mountain range, Oxen was the king here. Atsu did not approach Dog Head Mountain. It hid in a dense bush and watched as Oxen climbed all the way to the peak of Dog Head Mountain. Then it lay down like before. Atsu looked at the mountain and the countless animals on it. Its eyes gradually revealed a strong yearning, but there was still a hint of fear in its eyes. After a while, Atsu looked up at the sky and saw that it was already dark. After a moment of hesitation, it finally silently retreated and left the place in the shadows, running into the distance. Looking at it from behind, its figure was very lonely, like a black shadow running alone into the darkness that was about to descend. The next day, Lu Chen finished serving the red ambergris early in the morning. He then left Kunlun, descended the mountain, and went to Kunwa City. In this huge and lively city, when he stood on the street amidst the bustling stream of people coming and going, Lu Chen was in a trance for a moment. There were thousands of people on the street, and everyone had their own happiness, anger, sorrow, and joy, and their own stories. Everyone had their own destination, and everyone should also have their own home. But he had never thought that on this day, on the street of Kunwa City, the 28-year-old Lu Chen suddenly thought of the word home, for no rhyme or reason. Ever since he was young, he didn't remember ever having a family. He couldn't even remember the faces of any of his relatives. As he stood on the street, lost in thought, past events and old friends flashed through his mind like a painting. What was a home? What did it look like? What did it feel like to have a home? A man and a woman together? Perhaps that was home? He thought for a moment, and Ding Dong's face flashed across his mind. Then he gently shook his head. He thought again about the memories that were buried even deeper in his heart. That once sweet and gentle face, that smiling woman in the desolate valley of the land of chaos, that person who once gave him the only trace of warmth in those turbulent, dangerous, and dark years. He slightly lowered his head and silently walked forward. Then he once again suppressed that memory in his heart. This city was so big, but he only had one place to go. In the Black Hill Pavilion in a secluded alley, the fat old Ma had a somewhat strange expression on his face. He looked at Lu Chen sitting across from him. He watched as Lu Chen slowly picked up his wine cup and drank it. Lu Chen didn't put it down but looked like he was deep in thought. Old Ma frowned and said, "What's wrong with you?" Lu Chen's body moved, as if he was roused from his thoughts. He said, Old Ma said, "You seem a bit strange today. Did something happen in the Kunlun party?" "Oh, nothing happened," Lu Chen said perfunctorily. He poured himself another cup of wine and drank it. After a while, he suddenly looked at Old Ma and asked, "Old Ma, I want to ask you something." "Speak. Is there anyone else in your family?" Old Ma was startled. He said, "Why are you suddenly asking me this?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "It's nothing. I just thought of asking." Old Ma hesitated for a moment and said, "There's no one else. It's just me." Lu Chen glanced at him, and something flickered in the depths of his eyes. He suddenly said, "You lied to me." Old Ma nodded and said, "You're right. I lied to you." Lu Chen snorted and said, "Why is that? You don't trust me?" Old Ma said, "We've been friends for 10 years. I can put my life in your hands in times of danger. Do you think I should trust you?" Lu Chen stared at his eyes and said, "Then why don't you tell me the truth? You know it. Why ask me?" "I don't know. Tell me." Old Ma suddenly laughed. But there was not much joy in his smile. After a while, he said lightly, "You're an unlucky person. As long as you're involved with someone, they will often suffer misfortune, right?" Lu Chen suddenly stopped talking. He silently looked at Old Ma. His eyes were deep and distant like the dark sea. The room suddenly became quiet. There was not a single sound. A cold wind blew in the alley outside the house. It blew up some grass on the wall. It trembled in the wind and brought a little loneliness. After a long time, Lu Chen slowly put down the wineglass in his hand. He looked at Old Ma and said calmly, "Why do you say it so bluntly?" Old Ma shrugged and said calmly, "You asked me. I don't want to lie to you." Lu Chen grunted and lowered his head. He didn't look at him anymore. He seemed to be a little disinterested. After he looked away, Old Ma seemed to be relieved. He took the wine jug and refilled his glass. But suddenly he felt a little cold on his back. It was like a thin needle stinging. It was like the feeling of cold sweat. Old Ma stared at the wine in front of him. After a while, he drank it in one gulp. "I met Su Qingjun and talked to her." Lu Chen's voice came from the front. Old Ma was excited. He looked at him and said, "How is it? You didn't really go to find trouble with that person, did you? Let me tell you. From the news I heard, Su Qingjun is a real genius. With your current strength, even 10 of you won't be a match for her." Lu Chen looked at Old Ma and smiled. A faint light flashed in his eyes. He said, "You're right. That's why I didn't do anything." Old Ma's face darkened. "You didn't do anything? Then you mean that you really have the thought of doing something? I say, can you be more honest? Focus on catching the traitor. Don't keep causing trouble." Lu Chen looked at Old Ma with interest. "That's strange. Why are you so sure that I'm causing trouble by getting close to Su Qingjun? Why can't she be the traitor?" Old Ma was stunned for a moment. His face suddenly changed. His expression immediately became serious. He whispered, "You suspect it's her? Everyone in the Kunlun party is now a suspect in my eyes, except for 2 people." Old Ma said, "Who is it?" Lu Chen pointed at him and said, "One is you, and the other is the damn Baldy." Old Ma smiled bitterly. He pondered for a moment and frowned. There are no less than 100,000 people in the Kunlun party, including the handyman disciples. If you think they are suspects, then we can forget about other things for the rest of our lives. We can't find them. So as you said before, the traitor should be someone with some ability and status. However, if it's Su Qingjun..." Old Ma paused and said seriously, "I don't think it's her." Lu Chen said, "Why?" Old Ma spread his hands and said, "Because her family background is too good, and her background is completely clean. Coupled with her extraordinary talent, can you tell me one reason why such a person would want to walk the path of evil?" Lu Chen smiled. He slowly picked up the wineglass but didn't drink it. Instead, he rubbed it between his fingers for a while. Then he suddenly said, "Back then, there was someone like you who said something similar." "What?" Old Ma asked. "The elder of the evil cult, Yun Shuyang, teacher." For some reason, Lu Chen's voice seemed to become a little erratic as he said faintly, When I first came to his side when I was young, there were people who also suspected me. After investigating for a while, there were no results, but they were still worried. Yun Shouyang smiled and said to them, "In this world, how can there be a person who throws away the once-in-a-lifetime genius of the 5 pillars, not as a disciple, but as a spy?" The muscles on old Ma's chubby face suddenly twitched. Lu Chen didn't look at him. He just stared at the wine glass in his hand, lost in thought. After a while, he suddenly smiled and drank the wine in the glass. Then he said to old Ma, "You see, there is nothing impossible in this world. On that Kunlun mountain, before the truth comes out, I don't believe anyone." Pa! A soft sound was heard. It was him gently putting the wine glass on the table. Then he stood up and turned to walk to the door. At the same time, he said, "Investigate the Su family, especially Su Qingjuan's childhood. No matter how big or small it is, tell me." Old Ma hesitated for a while and said, "Okay." Lu Chen walked to the door and had one foot out, but suddenly his body stopped, as if he had thought of something. After a moment of hesitation, he turned to old Ma and said, "There is one more person. You should also investigate." Chapter 118. Who is it? Oma asked. "The 10-year-old genius girl, White Lotus, from the Bai family in the city." Old Ma's expression changed, as if he took a deep breath. He frowned and said, "What are you doing? She's just a 10-year-old girl, not to mention she's a 5-pillar genius, and she's about to become Hakushin Jinkuan's disciple. His words suddenly stopped, as if he had thought of something. He looked at Lu Chen, his mouth moved a few times, but no words came out. Lu Chen looked at him quietly. After a moment he said, "Don't forget, I was only 11 or 12 years old at that time. As for the disciple of a perfected monarch, a 5-pillar genius." He smiled, with a hint of mockery on his face, and then looked up at the sky. In the narrow and long sky above the alley, a white cloud floated across the blue sky. Old Ma's voice sounded behind him, sounding a little bitter. He said, "I know, I'll look into it." Lu Chen responded, then walked out of the gate and walked into the distance. The days in the Kunlun Mountains were peaceful and stable, just like the clear water stream in the Qingshui Pond back then. It flowed every day, so quiet that it was almost undetectable. In the fragrance garden, Lu Chen had gradually become familiar with the situation here. With his gentle temperament, he also got to know many people here. Many of them were handyman disciples like him, and some were official disciples of Bai Chao Tang, who were in charge of this area. As for his own job, the red herring ginseng, it was also growing well these days. It even looked a little more domineering. To be specific, the growth range of the ginseng grass around the red herring ginseng had expanded a little. Of course, Lu Chen did not feel sorry for the wild grass and trees that died because of the domineering red amber ginseng. Anyway, Bai Chao Tang had already reserved enough territory here. The bigger the area where the ginseng grass grew, the better the red ambergris grew. After that day, Su Qingjun came again. After seeing the vitality of the red ginseng, it could be seen that she was in a good mood. Although she was not really happy, her attitude towards Lu Chen had improved a lot. However, compared to the spiritual fields in the Stone Pan Valley, the spiritual herbs in the Flowing Fragrance Garden were generally of a much higher grade, but they also took a much longer time to grow. The red amber ginseng had already grown to its current size, but there were still at least 3 months before it could be harvested. This kind of thing couldn't be rushed. Bai Chao Tang wouldn't do something like pulling the seedlings to help them grow. In fact, the current growth rate was already twice as fast as the growth rate of the wild red amber ginseng. This was because human cultivators were meticulously nurturing them, using their spiritual energy to take good care of them. However, as a result, Lu Chen was a little bored after finishing his daily work. But perhaps it was because Su Qingjun had said it once. Although Lu Chen didn't lower his head and admit defeat at that time, from that day onwards, he never fell asleep in the spiritual fields again. He began to wander around in the Flowing Fragrance Garden. However, because there were higher grade and priceless spiritual materials planted in the depths of the Flowing Fragrance Garden, part-time disciples like them couldn't go in for the time being. Therefore, the places he walked were basically in the grass garden. The grass garden's territory was actually quite large, and there were many kinds of spiritual herbs and spiritual materials planted here. Over the years, there were indeed many part-time disciples who worked here. However, to Lu Qin, the people closest to him and the easiest to befriend were naturally the group of miscellaneous affairs disciples who had come with him this time. After a period of time, he got to know the other 9 out of the 10 part-time disciples. The one he got along with the most was a 25-year-old man named Xianxia. The name Xianxia was very interesting. It sounded a bit rustic, but in fact, it had a great vision. Wasn't the dream of millions and millions of people in the world to live forever? Therefore, this name had long been overused by people. On the path of cultivation, immortality and becoming an immortal were practically the ultimate goals of all cultivators. Since ancient times, it seemed that no one had been able to achieve it, not even deity transformation stage true monarchs. Xianxia was also a very interesting person. He was a very diligent and down-to-earth person. He was very serious when dealing with people and had a good temper. In layman's terms, he was an honest person. However, he didn't know why his luck was a bit bad, so it seemed that Xianxia's life was a bit unlucky. 100 years ago, He clan was an outstanding clan in Kunwa City. However, 30 years ago, no one remembered it anymore. Xianxia's ancestor was an outstanding figure. Moreover, he was a genuine Yuanying spiritual master of the Kunlun party. He was all-powerful and proud, but his fate wasn't too good. During a great battle in the Land of Chaos, he died tragically at the hands of the cruel devil sects demons. The speed at which he clan declined was quite shocking. No one knew the specific reason. In short, from the time when they were a great clan, no one knew the reason. In Xianxia's generation, he unexpectedly had no connections to speak of. Xianxia loved to cultivate. Ever since he was young, he dreamed of restoring the glory of He clan's ancestors and restoring the He clan's reputation. He was very ambitious about this and prepared for more than 20 years. In the end, he sold all the family property left behind by his ancestors in exchange for an opportunity to see the immortal inspection mirror. However, fate was always full of malice toward honest people. The 5 elements divine disc in the immortal inspection mirror gave him a head-on blow. His talent was so poor that he almost couldn't step onto the path of cultivation. In the end, he bitterly begged for a position as a part-time disciple that seemed destined to have no future. This position also completely emptied out the last of his assets. Is it worth it? That afternoon, when the warm sunlight shone on the spirit fields in the flowing fragrance garden, Lu Qin asked Xianxia this question as they sat side by side and chatted idly. Lu Qin looked very serious. He even used his hand to lightly gesture and said, "If you give up on the idea of cultivating and rely on the 2 old mansions left by your ancestors in Kunwa City, you might be able to live a peaceful and stable life. Why do you have to suffer here? It's not especially hard." Xianxia had the face of an honest person. He looked very ordinary, neither handsome nor ugly. He seemed to have a good impression of Lu Qin. Perhaps because the 2 of them had almost the same circumstances, he became closer to Lu Qin. Therefore, he smiled and said to Lu Qin, "Besides, if I muddle along in Kunwa City for the rest of my life, wouldn't it be completely hopeless?" "Hopeless?" Lu Qin shook his head. He looked at Xianxia and said, "But I don't think part-time disciples have much hope. Since ancient times, I've never heard of a pillar disciple becoming a Taoist Yuanying." Xianxia nodded. He didn't seem to have any objections to Lu Qin's words. He said, "That's indeed very difficult. However, in our Kunlun party, there's a kind of high-grade spiritual medicine called the immortal swamp pill. It's said that it has the miraculous effect of improving the innate talent of disciples with insufficient talent. Moreover, the less talented the disciple, the better the medicinal effect." Lu Qin couldn't help but laugh. He shook his head and said, "I've heard of the immortal swamp pill you mentioned, but it's a priceless treasure. The spiritual materials needed to concoct it are all heavenly materials and earthly treasures. Throughout history, only wealthy and noble clans would occasionally ask people to concoct a pill for them. Moreover, more than half of the time, there's no effect." He then sighed and said, "It won't work if you pin your hopes on this." He Changxing was silent for a moment before he nodded and said, "You're right." Lu Chen glanced at him and said, "What? Do you have other ideas?" He Changxing grunted and said, "Yes." Lu Chen's interest was piqued. He smiled and said, "Let's hear it." He Changxing smiled and looked around. From time to time, he could see part-time disciples of similar status working hard in the spiritual fields. He stared at those figures for a while and said, "Our He clan has been mediocre for 3 generations. If I still don't pull myself together, in the future, I have to continue the family line and have my own children. Don't tell me I'm going to let them live the lives of ordinary people. If I'm destined to lie at the bottom of Kunlun Mountain like this for the rest of my life, unable to get up and standing up, and can only struggle and work hard in this spiritual field for the rest of my life, am I going to let my children suffer like this in the future?" He Changxing looked at Lu Chen and a rare bright light flashed in his eyes. It was a yearning and endless expectation for the future. He said softly, "If I suffer a little more in this Kunlun Mountain, I will eventually accumulate some things. In the future, my children will be stronger than I am now. Even if he still can't do it, as long as he continues like this, my grandchildren will definitely be better. If this continues for a long time, there will be a day when our He clan will definitely prosper again. Don't you think so?" He smiled and looked at Lu Chen, his eyes filled with the light of hope. Lu Chen looked at him quietly. After a while, he said, "Impossible, you must be dreaming." When Su Qingjun walked in from the outside of the fragrance garden, she hesitated for a moment when she reached the fork on the wide road. Finally, she decided to turn to the grass garden to take a look. The red ginseng that was currently being planted there was the main ingredient for refining a panacea. Her master, Masato Kihara, had already told her that once the red ginseng matured and grew, as long as the medicinal effect was good, she would personally ask Qian Deng, who was second to none in Baichao Tang, to refine that rare panacea. Once the medicine was ready, she could take the panacea and break through to the Jindan realm. The Jindan realm. She was only 22 years old. Such a young genius had never appeared in the Kunlun party in the past 200 years. Even though she had long been accustomed to her courageous and vigorous progress in cultivation since she was young, when she thought of the Jindan realm, she couldn't help but yearn and be excited. 2 people walked over from the road, one old and one young. Su Qingjun recognized the older white-haired woman. It was Jindan Friar of Baichao Tang, Melaleuca japonica. She hurriedly greeted her. Then she saw that the young girl beside Melaleuca japonica looked somewhat familiar. Soon she saw the scar on the young girl's cheek, so she quickly knew that the young girl was Exen. That incident had caused a sensation in the entire Kunlun party. Of course, she also knew about it. She smiled at Exen, and Exen also smiled back at her. It seemed that on this sunny day, the young girl was in a good mood. It seemed that she had gradually walked out of the haze of the previous day. After saying goodbye to Melaleuca japonica, Su Qingjun walked towards the grass garden. But not long after, she suddenly heard footsteps behind her. Looking back, she saw that Exen was also walking quickly towards her. Chapter 119. Exen also saw Su Qingjun walking in front of her. Her footsteps paused for a moment before she walked over. She then smiled and greeted Su Qingjun, saying, "Shiji Su, are you also going to the grass garden?" The road they were currently walking on was a side road that branched off from the main road and only led to the grass garden. Su Qingjun nodded and said, "I have a spiritual herb planted there, so I'm going to take a look. What about you? Are you also going to see the spiritual herb?" Exen smiled and said, "Not really. I have a friend working there, so I'm going to see him on the way." Su Qingjun smiled, and the 2 young and beautiful women naturally walked forward side by side, chatting along the way. The 2 of them had similar backgrounds. They were both daughters of influential families in Kunwa City. Their ages were also about the same, so as they chatted, they began to resonate with each other. For example, the beautiful scenery of Kunwa City and the stories of human relationships. They unexpectedly had quite a lot in common, so they suddenly felt a lot closer to each other. In the end, Exen sighed and said to Su Qingjun with a smile, I didn't expect Sister Su to be such an easy person to get along with. Su Qingjun smiled and said, "What do you mean? Could it be that you've heard before that I'm not easy to get along with?" No. EXN promptly denied and said with a smile, "That's because Sister Su, you've been so outstanding since you were young. After I learned about you, I always felt that you were more powerful than ordinary people like us in every aspect, as if you were high up above us. I never dared to think that I could be so close to you." Su Qingjun smiled and her eyes were gentle, but when her gaze swept over EXIN's pretty and youthful face, she saw the scar on the side of EXIN's white and rosy cheeks, which appeared exceptionally abrupt and dazzling on that youthful face. Her heart trembled for no reason. When she looked at EXIN again, there was a hint of pity in her eyes. She wanted to ask about this matter, but she quickly suppressed this thought. She looked at EXIN with a smile and chatted with her. It was as if she did not see anything wrong at all, as if the wound had never existed. Her expression seemed to become even more intimate. Just as they were about to reach the grass garden, a chirping sound suddenly came from above their heads. The two of them looked up and were startled. They saw a flock of about 8 or 9 birds fluttering their wings as they flew over their heads in a panic. EXN looked at the direction the flock of birds flew in and was shocked. Why are these birds flying into the grass garden? Su Qingjun furrowed her brows as well. She looked a little puzzled. The fragrance garden was a medicinal garden. All kinds of spiritual herbs and spiritual materials were planted, which were very valuable. However, since they were spiritual herbs rich in spiritual energy, in addition to being useful to human cultivators, they would naturally attract the covetous eyes of some birds and beasts. Therefore, in order to prevent spiritual materials from being damaged, Bai Chao Tang built walls and fences around the fragrance garden and sent people to patrol and guard, blocking all kinds of wild beasts in the forest on the ground. As for some birds that could fly, Bai Chao Tang naturally had countermeasures. They set up some talisman formations around the spiritual fields in the fragrance garden, and from time to time emitted some aura that was feared and disgusted by the birds, so there had never been any birds around the fragrance garden. But today, this flock of birds suddenly flew in the direction of the grass garden, as if they did not have any scruples all of a sudden. It was really strange. Su Qingjun pondered for a moment, and said with some uncertainty, "Perhaps the formation in the grass garden was suddenly damaged and lost its effectiveness? But there are guards and disciples patrolling the garden on weekdays. If it's just a few birds, it should be no big deal." EXN thought about it and nodded with a smile, saying, "Sister is right. Then let's continue." Su Qingjun agreed, and the two continued to walk towards the grass garden. As they walked, Su Qingjun looked up and saw that the sky was clear at the moment. The flock of birds that were flying seemed to be quite fast, and disappeared in the blink of an eye. They must have flown into the grass garden. Looking from afar, the grass garden was quiet, and it seemed no different from the past. But when she thought of those birds just now, for some reason, Su Qingjun suddenly felt a little uneasy in her heart. What had happened to the birds? In the grass garden, Lu Chen and He Changsheng stood opposite each other, and He Changsheng's face did not look very good. "Why?" He Changsheng asked Lu Chen in a low voice, frowning deeply. It was obvious that he was unhappy. Lu Chen looked at him for a while, then said, "You want to hear the truth? You are only a servant disciple, and your family has declined. You sold all your family's assets, and you have no one to help you other than yourself. You think that if you rely on yourself, you won't be able to leave much for your future children." Lu Chen said calmly, completely ignoring He Changsheng's pale face. "You think that one day, the descendants of the He family will one day rise again. Let's not talk about whether or not your descendants will be as stubborn as you, but have you ever thought that with your status, it is impossible for your children to enter the Kunlun party on their own? They will also have to go through the barrier of the immortal mirror. So, even if you work hard all your life and save something for your child, as long as one thing happens, it can easily turn your life's hard work into nothing. What is it?" He Changsheng couldn't help but ask. Lu Chen sighed. What if, after a few decades, the Kunlun party suddenly increases the fees to participate in the immortal mirror? He Changsheng's entire body trembled. His eyes widened. Impossible. The Kunlun party is a famous sect, they can't. What if? Lu Chen interrupted him with a question of his own. Xianxia murmured, what if, among this year's batch of servant disciples, there are many who bribed their way in? Do you really not know? It's only a matter of a few words. If someone really lacks money and becomes shameless, who will you go to reason with? Xianxia was tongue-tied and at a loss for words. His expression was unsightly like ash. Lu Chen looked at him and stretched out a hand, palm facing up. Look, in this world, people are born differently. Some people are born to stand at the top, and there are others, like you. He slowly turned his palm over and gently pressed it towards the ground. Watching the movement of his palm, Xianxia's body seemed to tremble slightly. His eyes didn't blink, but they seemed to have lost their previous brightness. Lu Chen pressed his palm very low, then said softly, think about it yourself. What right do you have to make a comeback? Xianxia raised his head, looked at him, and said, could it be that people like us will never be able to take another step forward in our lives? Could it be that our children and grandchildren can only be people under this person? Achieve immortality, ascend to the heavens on the great Tao, and all living beings have the fate of immortality. Aren't these words passed down from the golden mouths of our ancestors? He looked a little agitated, even a little angry. Fate of immortality, there always has been. Lu Chen said, but how small is the hope? Will the 100,000 people in Kunlun coincidentally fall on your head? Xianxia took a deep breath, his expression seemed to calm down a little, and said, if that's the case, then why are you telling me so much? Lu Chen looked at him and said, I just feel that you don't need to pin your hopes on the next generation. If there is fate of immortality, you can make a comeback in this life. If there is no fate of immortality, it's useless even if you struggle for a lifetime and pass it on to your children and grandchildren. Xianxia was silent for a long time and said, that makes sense. In the spirit fields, that man turned around and picked up the hoe, looking like he was going to work diligently again. Lu Chen stood at the side, and looked at him with interest and said, what, depressed? Xianxia didn't even raise his head, and said, yes, but no matter how depressed I am, I still have to work. Not waiting for fate of immortality? Of course, why not? What if a pie falls from the sky and hits me? Lu Chen smiled and said, if you have such luck, why don't you try to see if there's lightning in the daytime on this sunny day? Xianxia raised his head to look at the sky, and Lu Chen also raised his head to look into the distance, only to see that the sky was blue, and there was no movement at all. After a moment, the two withdrew their gazes and looked at each other. Lu Chen spread out his hands. Xianxia shook his head and said, that kind of thing is too unreliable, how can there really be? He suddenly cried out, and covered his head with his hand. Something fell from the sky, and just happened to hit his head. Lu Chen, who was standing at the side, was also startled, and subconsciously said, it can't be so coincidental. After a moment, the two looked at the same time, and then they were both startled. They saw that the thing that hit Xianxia's head was a ball of fluffy, and at this moment, it was thrown to the ground. Looking closely, it was a small bird. Xianxia bent down to pick it up, and held it in his palm to look at it, and said to Lu Chen, it's dead. Dead bird? Lu Chen was also surprised. Right at this moment, they heard a series of chirping sounds. The two of them looked up and saw a flock of about 4 to 5 birds flying over their heads in a panic and anxiously. Why are there birds here? Xianxia asked in puzzlement. I don't know. Lu Chen was also a little puzzled. He then glanced at the dead bird in Xianxia's hand, only to see that it was the most ordinary of chickadees, only half the size of a palm. At this moment, its dead body was curled up into a ball, as if even at death's door, this bird seemed to be unusually terrified. At this moment, a trace of uneasiness suddenly flashed in Lu Chen's heart, but he didn't know where this feeling came from. He also didn't know that not long ago, a similar feeling arose in Su Qingjuan's heart at the entrance of the grass garden. He turned around and looked at the few small birds flying far away, watching them flapping their wings in panic, desperately flying into the distance as if they were fleeing for their lives, and in the blink of an eye, disappeared into the distant mountain forest. He silently thought for a moment, and suddenly looked back, only to see that on the path of those birds, the undulating mountains of Kunlun, like a silent giant standing between heaven and earth. The mountains were deep and seemed to be locked in a dense fog. You're tuning in to the Wandering Hero YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.